We were hopelessly hemmed in by the black smoke. All that day and the morning of the next, there were signs of people in the next house. On Sunday evening, a feast at a window and moving lights. And later the slamming of a door, but I do not know who these people were. Nor what became of them. We saw nothing of the next day. The black smoke drifted slowly riverward, all through Monday morning, creeping nearer and nearer to us, driving at last along the roadway outside the house that hit us. A Martian came across the fields about midday, laying the stuff with a jet of superheated steam that hissed against the walls, smashed all the windows it touched, and scolded the curate's hand as he fled out of the front room. When at last we crept across the sudden rooms and looked out again, the country northward was as though a black snowstorm had passed over it. Looking towards the river, we were astonished to see an unaccountable redness mingling with the black of the scorched meadows for a time. We did not see how this change affected our position. See if that, we were relieved of our fear of the black smoke. But later I perceived that we were no longer hemmed in. But now we might get away, so soon as I realized that the way of escape was open. My dream of action returned, but the curate was lethargic, unreasonable. "We are safe here," he repeated. "Safe here." I resolved to leave him, would that I had. Wise or no for the artilleryman's teaching. I sought out food and drink. I had found oil and rags for my burns. And I also took a hat and a flannel shirt that I found in one of the bedrooms. When it was clear to him that I meant to go alone, had reconciled myself to going alone, he suddenly rose himself to come. And all being quiet throughout the afternoon, we started about 5 o'clock, as I should judge, along the black and rode to Sunbury. In Sunbury and at intervals along the road were dead bodies lying in contorted attitudes. Horses as well as men, overturned carts and luggage, all covered thickly with black dust. That pole of cindery powder made me think of what I had read. At the destruction of Pompeii, we got to Hampton Court without misadventure, our minds full of strange and unfamiliar appearances. And at Hampton Court, our eyes were relieved to find a patch of green that had escaped the suffocating drift. We went through Bushy Park, with its deer going to and through, under the chestnut, and some men and women hurrying in the distance towards Hampton, and so we came to Twickenham. These were the first people we saw, away across the road. The woods beyond Ham and Petersham were still afire. Twickenham was uninjured by either heat, ray, or black smoke, and there were more people about here. Though none could give us news, for the most part they were like ourselves, taking advantage of a lull to shift their quarters. I have an impression that many of the houses here were still occupied by scared inhabitants, too frightened even for flight here too. The evidence of a hasty road was abundant. Along the road I remember most vividly 3 smashed bicycles in a heap, pounded into the road by the wheels of subsequent cars. We crossed Richmond Bridge about 8:30. We hurried across the exposed bridge, of course, but I noticed floating down the stream a number of red masses some many feet across. I did not know what these were. There was no time for scrutiny, and I put a more horrible interpretation on them than they deserved. Here again on the Surrey side were black dust that had once been smoke, and dead bodies a heap near the approach to the station. But we had no glimpses of the Martians until we were some way towards Barnes. We saw in the black and distance a group of 3 people running down a side street towards the river, but otherwise it seemed deserted. Up the hill Richmond town was burning briskly outside the town of Richmond. There was no trace of the black smoke. Then suddenly, as we approached Kew, came a number of people running, and the upper works of a Martian fighting machine loomed in sight over the housetops, not 100 yards away from us. We stood aghast at our danger and had the Martian look down. We must immediately have perished. We were so terrified that we dare not go on, but turned aside and hid in a shed in a garden. There the curate crouched, weeping silently and refusing to stare again. But my fixed idea of reaching Leatherhead would not let me rest, and in the twilight I ventured out again. I went through a shrubbery and along a passage beside a big house, standing in its own grounds. And so I merged upon the road towards Q the curate. I left in the shed, but he came hurrying after me. That second start was the most full, hearty thing I ever did. For it was manifest the Martians were about us. No sooner had the curate overtaken me than we saw either the fighting machine we had seen before or another far away. Across the meadows in the direction of Q Lodge, 4 or 5 little black figures hurried before it. Across the green-gray of the field, and in a moment it was evident. This Martian pursued them in 3 strains. He was among them, and they ran, radiating from his feet in all directions. He used no heat ray to destroy them, but picked them up one by one. Apparently, he tossed them into the great metallic carrier, which projected behind him, much as a workman's basket hangs over his shoulder. It was the first time I realized that the Martians might have any other purpose than destruction with defeated humanity. We stood for a moment petrified, then turned and fled through a gate behind us. Into a walled garden, fell into rather than found a fortunate ditch, and lay there scarce, daring to whisper to each other until the stars were out, I suppose. It was nearly 11 o'clock before we gathered courage to start. Again, no longer venturing into the road, but sneaking along hedge rules and through plantations, and watching keenly through the darkness. He on the right and I on the left, for the Martians, who seemed to be all about us in one place. We blundered upon a scorched and blackened area, now cooling and ashing, and a number of scattered dead bodies of men, burned horribly about the heads and trunks, but with their legs and boots mostly intact, and of dead horses 50 feet, perhaps behind a line of ripped guns and smashed gun carriages. Sheen, it seemed, had escaped destruction, but the place was silent and deserted. Here we happened on no dead, though the night was too dark for us to see into the side roads of the place. And Sheen, my companion, suddenly complained of faintness and thirst, and we decided to try one of the houses. The first house we entered, after a little difficulty with the window, was a small semi-detached villa, and I found nothing eatable left in the place. But some moldy cheese there was, however, water to drink, and I took a hatchet, which promised to be useful in our next house breaking. We then crossed to a place where the road turns towards Mortley. Here there stood a white house within a walled garden, and in the pantry of this domicile we found a store of food to loaves of bread in a pan, an uncooked steak, and a half of a ham. I give this catalogue so precisely because, as it happened, we were destined to subsist upon this store. For the next fortnight, bottled beer stood under a shelf, and there were 2 bags of haricot beans and some limp lettuces. This pantry opened into a kind of wash-up kitchen, and in this was firewood. There was also a cupboard, in which we found nearly a dozen of burgundy tin soups, and salmon, and 2 tins of biscuits. We sat in the adjacent kitchen in the dark, but we dare not strike a light and eat bread and ham, and drank beer out of the same bottle. The curate, who was still timorous and restless, was now oddly enough for pushing on, and I was urging him to keep up his strength by eating, when the thing happened that was to imprison us. "It can't be midnight yet," I said. And then came a blinding glare of vivid green light. Everything in the kitchen leaped out, clearly visible in green and black, and vanished again. And then followed such a concussion as I have never heard before. Our sins so close on the heels of this as to seem instantaneous. Came a thud behind me, a clash of glass, a crash and rattle of falling masonry all about us. Then the plaster of the ceiling came down upon us, smashing into a multitude of fragments upon our heads. I was knocked headlong across the floor, against the oven handle, and stunned. I was insensible for a long time. The curate told me, and when I came to, we were in darkness again, and he, with a face wet, as I found afterwards with blood from a cut forehead, was dabbing water over me. For some time I could not recollect what had happened. Then things came to me slowly. A bruise on my temple asserted itself. "Are you better?" asked the curate, in a whisper at last. I answered him. I sat up. "Don't move," he said. The floor is covered with smashed crockery from the dresser. You can't possibly move without making a noise, and I fancy they are outside. We both sat quite silent, so that we could scarcely hear each other breathing. Everything seemed deadly still, but once something near us. Some plaster or broken brickwork slid down with a rumbling sound outside. And very near was an intermittent metallic rattle. That said the curate, when presently it happened again. "Yes," I said, "but what is it?" "A Martian," said the curate. I listened again. It was not like the heat ray, I said, and for a time I was inclined to think one of the great fighting machines had stumbled against the house, as I had seen one stumble against the tower of Shepparton Church. Our situation was so strange and incomprehensible that for 3 or 4 hours, until the dawn came, we scarcely moved. And then the light filtered in, not through the window, which remained black, but through a triangular aperture between a beam and a heap of broken bricks in the wall. Behind us, the interior of the kitchen, we now saw grayly for the first time. The window had been burst in by a massive garden mold which floored over the table, upon which we had been sitting, and lay about our feet. Outside, the soil was banked high against the house. At the top of the window frame, we could see an operated drain pipe. The floor was littered with smashed hardware. The end of the kitchen towards the house was broken into, and since the daylight shone in there, it was evident the greater part of the house had collapsed. Contrasting vividly with this ruin, with the neat dresser stained in the fashion pale green, and with a number of copper and tin vessels below it, the wallpaper imitating blue and white tiles, and a couple of colored supplements fluttering from the walls above the kitchen range. As the dawn grew clearer, we saw through the gap in the wall the body of a Martian, standing sentinel, I suppose, over the still glowing cylinder. At the sight of that, we crawled as circumspectly as possible out of the twilight of the kitchen into the darkness of the scullery. Abruptly, the right interpretation dawned upon my mind. "The 5th cylinder," I whispered. "The 5th shot from Mars has struck this house and buried us under the ruins." For a time the curate was silent, and then he whispered, "God have mercy upon us." I heard him presently whimpering to himself, save for that sound. We lay quite still in the scullery. I, for my part, scarce dared to breathe, and sat with my eyes fixed on the faint light of the kitchen door. I could just see the curate's face, a dim oval shape, and its collar and cuffs. Outside that began a metallic hammering, then a violent hooting, and then again, after a quiet interval, a hissing, like the hissing of an engine. These noises, for the most part problematical, continued intermittently and seemed, if anything, to increase in number as time wore on. Presently a measured thudding, and a vibration that made everything about us quiver, and the vessels in the pantry ring and shift, began and continued once the light was eclipsed, and the ghostly kitchen doorway became absolutely dark. For many hours we must have crouched there, silent and shivering, until our tired attention failed. At last I found myself awake and very hungry. I am inclined to believe we must have spent the greater portion of a day. Before that awakening, my hunger was at a strain, so insistent that it moved me to action. I told the curate I was going to seek food, and felt my way towards the pantry. He made me no answer, but as soon as I began eating, the faint noise I made stirred him up, and I heard him crawling after me. Chapter 2. What we saw from the ruined house. After eating we crept back to the scullery, and there I must have dosed again, for when presently I looked round, I was alone. The thudding vibration continued, with wearisome persistence. I whispered for the curate several times, and at last felt my way to the door of the kitchen. It was still daylight, and I perceived him across the room, lying against the triangular hole that looked out upon the Martians. His shoulders were hunched, so that his head was hidden from me. I could hear a number of noises, almost like those in an engine shed, and the place locked with that beating thud. Through the aperture in the wall, I could see the top of a tree touch with gold, and the warm blue of a tranquil evening sky. For a minute or so I remained watching the curate, and then I advanced. Crouching and stepping with extreme care, I made the broken crockery that littered the floor. I touched the curate's leg, and he started so violently that a mass of plaster went sliding down outside and fell with a load impact. I gripped his arm, fearing he might cry out, and for a long time we crouched motionless. Then I turned to see how much of our rampart remained. The detachment of the plaster had left a vertical slit open in the debris, and by raising myself cautiously across a beam, I was able to see out of this gap into what had been overnight a quiet suburban roadway. Vast indeed was the change that we beheld. The fifth cylinder must have fallen right into the midst of the house we had first visited. The building had vanished, completely smashed, pulverized, and despaired by the blow. The cylinder lay no far beneath the original foundations, deep in a hole already vastly larger than the pit I looked into. At walking the earth around, it had splashed under that tremendous impact. Splashed is the only word, and lay in heaped piles that hid the masses of the adjacent houses. It had behaved exactly like mud under the violent blow of a hammer. Our house had collapsed backward. The front portion, even on the ground floor, had been destroyed completely. By a chance, the kitchen and scullery had escaped and stood, buried now under soil and ruins, closed in by tons of air from every side. Safe towards the cylinder, over that aspect we hung. Now on the very edge of the great circular pit the Martians were engaged in making. The heavy beating sound was evidently just behind us, and ever and again a bright green vapor drove up like a veil across our people. The cylinder was already opened. In the center of the pit, and on the farther edge of the pit, amid the smashed and gravel-heaped shrubbery, one of the great fighting machines, deserted by its occupant, stood stiff and tall against the evening sky. At first I scarcely noticed the pit and the cylinder, although it had been convenient to describe them first, on account of the extraordinary, glittering mechanism I saw busy in the excavation, and on account of the strange creatures that were crawling slowly and painfully across the heaped mold near it. The mechanism, it certainly was, that held my attention first. It was one of those complicated fabrics that have since been called handling machines, and the study of which has already given such an enormous impetus to terrestrial invention. As it dawned upon me first, it presented a sort of metallic spider with 5 jointed agile legs, and with an extraordinary number of jointed levers, bars, and reaching and clutching tentacles about its body. Most of its arms were retracted, but with 3 long tentacles. It was fishing out a number of rods, plates, and bars which lined the covering, and apparently strengthened the walls of the cylinder. These, as it extracted them, were lifted out and deposited upon a level surface of earth. Behind it, its motion was so swift, complex, and perfect that at first I did not see it as a machine. In spite of its metallic glitter, the fighting machines were coordinated and animated to an extraordinary pitch, but nothing to compare with this. People who have never seen these structures, and have only the ill-imagined efforts of artists, or the imperfect descriptions of such eyewitnesses as myself to go on, scarcely realize that living quality. I recall particularly the illustration of one of the first pamphlets. To give a consecutive account of the war, the artist had evidently made a hasty study of one of the fighting machines, and there his knowledge ended. He presented them as tilted, stiff tripods without either flexibility or subtlety, and with an altogether misleading monotony of effect. The pamphlet containing these renderings had a considerable vogue, and I mention them here simply to warn the reader against the impression they may have created. They were no more like the Martians I saw in action than a Dutch doll is like a human being, to my mind. The pamphlet would have been much better without them. At first I see, the handling machine did not impress me as a machine, but as a crab-like creature, with a glittering entanglement, the controlling Martian, whose delicate tentacles activated its movements, seeming to be simply the equivalent of the crab cerebral portion. But then I perceived the resemblance of its gray-brown, shiny leathery integument to that of the other, sprawling bodies beyond, and the true nature of this dexterous workman dawned upon me. With that realization, my interest shifted to those other creatures, the real Martians. Already I had had a transient impression of these, and the first nausea no longer obscured by observation. Moreover, I was concealed and motionless, and under no urgency of action. Beware, I now saw the most unearthly creatures. It is possible to conceive they were huge round bodies, or rather heads about 4 feet in diameter, each body having in front of it a face. This face had no nostrils. Indeed, the Martians do not seem to have had any sense of smell, but it had a pair of very large, dark-colored eyes, and just beneath this, a kind of fleshy beak in the back of this head or body. I scarcely know how to speak of. It was the single tight tympanic surface, since known to be anatomically an ear, though it must have been almost useless, in our dense ear. In a group round the mouth were 16 slender, almost whip-like tentacles, arranged into bunches of 8 each. These bunches have since been named aptly by that distinguished anatomist Professor Hosea, the hands. Even as I saw these Martians for the first time, they seemed to be endeavoring to raise themselves on these hands, but of course, with the increased weight of terrestrial conditions, this was impossible. There is no reason to suppose they're on Mars. They may have progressed upon them with some facility. The internal anatomy, I may remark here, as dissection has since shown, was almost equally simple. The greater part of the structure was the brain, sending enormous nerves to the eyes, ear and tactile tentacles. Besides this, with a bulky lungs into which the mouth opened, and the heart and its vessels, the pulmonary distress caused by the denser atmosphere and greater gravitational attraction was only too evident in the convulsive movements of the outer skin. And this was the sum of the Martian organs. Strange as it may seem to a human being, all the complex apparatus of digestion, which makes up the bulk of our bodies, did not exist in the Martians. They were heads, merely heads. Entrails they had none. They did not eat, much less digest. Instead, they took the fresh, living blood of other creatures and injected it into their own veins. I have myself seen this being done, as I shall mention in its place, but squeamish as I may seem, I cannot bring myself to describe what I could not endure even to continue watching. Let it suffice to see blood obtained from a still living animal, in most cases from a human being, was run directly by means of a little pipette into the recipient canal. The bare idea of this is, no doubt, horribly repulsive to us, but at the same time I think that we should remember how repulsive our carnivorous habits would seem to an intelligent rabbit. The physiological advantages of the practice of injection are undeniable. If one thinks of the tremendous waste of human time and energy occasioned by eating and the digestive process, our bodies are half made up of glands and tubes and organs, occupied in turning heterogeneous food into blood. The digestive processes and their reaction upon the nervous system sap our strength and color our minds. Men go happy or miserable, as they have healthy or unhealthy livers or sound gastric glands, but the Martians were lifted above all these organic fluctuations of mood and emotion. Their undeniable preference for men as their source of nourishment is partly explained by the nature of the remains of the victims they had brought with them as provisions from Mars. These creatures, to judge from the shriveled remains that have fallen into human hands, were bipeds with flimsy siliceous skeletons, almost like those of the siliceous sponges, and feeble musculature, standing about 6 feet high and having round, erect heads and large eyes and flinty sockets. 2 or 3 of these seem to have been brought in each cylinder, and all were killed before Earth was reached. It was just as well for them. The mere attempt to stand upright upon our planet would have broken every bone in their bodies. And while I'm engaged in this description, I may add in this place certain further details which, although they were not all evident to us at the time, will enable the reader who is unacquainted with them to form a clearer picture of these offensive creatures. In 3 other points, their physiology differed strangely from ours. Their organisms did not sleep, any more than the heart of man sleeps, since they had no extensive, muscular mechanism to recuperate. That periodical extinction was unknown to them. They had little or no sense of fatigue, it would seem, on Earth. They could never have moved without effort, yet even to the last they kept in action. In 24 hours they did 24 hours of work, as even on Earth is perhaps the case with the ants in the next place. Wonderful as it seems in a sexual world, the Martians were absolutely without sex, and therefore without any of the tumultuous emotions that arise from that difference among men. A young Martian, there can now be no dispute, was really born upon Earth during the war, and it was found attached to its parent, partially buddied off just as young lilybulbs bud off, or like the young animals in the freshwater polyp. In man and all the higher terrestrial animals, such a method of increase has disappeared, but even on this Earth, it was certainly the primitive method among the lower animals up, even to those first cousins of the vertebrate animals. The tunicates that to processes occur side by side, but finally, the sexual methods superseded its competitor altogether. On Mars, however, just the reverse has apparently been the case. It is worthy of remark that a certain speculative writer of quasi-scientific repute, writing long before the Martian invasion, did forecast for man a final structure, not unlike the actual Martian condition. His prophecy, I remember, appeared in November or December 1893 in a long-defunct publication, the Palmer Budget, and I recall a caricature of it in a pre-Martian periodical called Punch. He pointed out, writing in a foolish, facetious tone, that the perfection of mechanical appliances must ultimately supersede limbs, the perfection of chemical devices, digestion, that such organs as hair, external nose, teeth, ears, and chin were no longer essential parts of the human being, and that the tendency of natural selection would lie in the direction of their steady diminution. Through the coming ages, the brain alone remained a cardinal necessity. Only one other part of the body had a strong case for survival, and that was the hand, teacher and agent of the brain. While the rest of the body dwindled, the hands would grow larger. There is many a true word written in jest, and here in the Martians we have beyond dispute the actual accomplishment of such a suppression of the animal side of the organism by the intelligence. To me it is quite credible that the Martians may be descended from beings not unlike ourselves, by a gradual development of brain and hands, the latter giving rise to the 2 bunches of delicate tentacles, at last at the expense of the rest of the body. Without the body, the brain would, of course, become a mere selfish intelligence, without any of the emotional substratum of the human being. The last salient point in which the systems of these creatures differ from Earth was in what one might have thought of very trivial, particular microorganisms, which cause so much disease and pain on Earth, have either never appeared upon Mars, or Martian sanitary science eliminated them ages ago. 100 diseases, all the fevers and contagions of human life consumption, cancers, tumors, and such morbidities, never enter the scheme of their life. And speaking of the differences between the life on Mars and terrestrial life, I may allude here to the curious suggestions of the red weed. Apparently, the vegetable kingdom in Mars, instead of having green for a dominant color, is of a vivid blood red tint. At any rate, the seeds, which the Martians intentionally or accidentally brought with them, gave rise in all cases to red-colored growths. Only that known popularly as the red weed, however, gained any footing in competition with terrestrial forms. The red creeper was quite a transitory growth, and few people have seen it growing. For a time, however, the red weed grew with astonishing vigor and luxuriance. It spread up the sides of the pit by the 3rd or 4th day of our imprisonment, and its cactus-like branches formed a carmine fringe to the edges of our triangular window. And afterwards, I found it broadcast throughout the country. and especially wherever there was a stream of water. The Martians had what appears to have been an auditory organ, a single full round drum the back of the head, body and eyes, with a visual range not very different from ours, except that according to Phillips, blue and violet were as black to them. It is commonly supposed that they communicated by sounds and tentacular gesticulations. This is asserted, for instance, in the evil but hastily compiled pamphlet written, evidently by someone not an eyewitness, of Martian actions to which I have already alluded, and which so far has been the chief source of information concerning them. No surviving human being saw so much of the Martians in action. As I did, I take no credit to myself for an accident, but the fact is so, and I assert that I watched them closely time after time, and that I have seen for 5 and once 6 of them sluggishly, performing the most elaborately complicated operations, together without either sound or gesture. Their peculiar hooting invariably preceded feeding. It had no modulation and was, I believe, in no sense a signal, but merely the expiration of air, preparatory to the suctional operation. I have a certain claim to at least an elementary knowledge of psychology, and in this matter I am convinced, as firmly as I am convinced of anything, that the Martians interchanged thoughts without any physical intermediation, and I have been commenced to this, in spite of strong preconceptions, before the Martian invasion. As an occasional reader hero there may remember, I had written with some little vehemence against the telepathic theory. The Martians wore no clothing. Their conceptions of ornament and decorum were necessarily different from ours, and not only were they evidently much less sensible of changes of temperature than we are, but changes of pressure do not seem to have affected their health at all seriously. Yet though they wore no clothing, it was in the other artificial additions to their bodily resources that their great superiority over man lay. We men with our bicycles and road skates, our Lillianville sewing machines, our guns and sticks and so forth, are just in the beginning of the evolution that the Martians have worked out. They have become practically mere brains, wearing different bodies according to their needs, just as men wear suits of clothes, and take a bicycle in a hurry or an umbrella in the wet, and all their appliances. Perhaps nothing is more wonderful to a man than the curious fact that what is the dominant feature of almost all human devices in mechanism is absent. The wheel is absent. Among all the things they brought to earth, there is no trace or suggestion of their use of wheels. One would have at least expected it in locomotion. And in this connection, it is curious to remark that even on this earth, nature has never hit upon the wheel, or has preferred other experience to its development. And not only did the Martians either not know of, which is incredible, or abstain from the wheel, but in their apparatus, singularly little use is made of the fixed pivot, or relatively fixed pivot, with circular motions thereabout confined to one plane. Almost all the joints of the machinery present, a complicated system of sliding parts, moving over small, but beautifully curved friction bearings. And while upon this matter of detail, it is remarkable that the long leverages of their machines are, in most cases, actuated by sort of sham musculature of the discs. In an elastic sheath, these discs become polarized and drawn closely and powerfully together when traversed by current of electricity. In this way, the curious parallelism to animal motions, which was so striking and disturbing to the human beholder, was attained. Such quasi-muscles are bounded in the crab lake handling machine, which on my first peeping out of the slit, I watched unpacking the cylinder. It seemed infinitely more alive than the actual Martians, lying beyond it in the sunset light, panting, stirring ineffectual tentacles and moving feebly after their vast journey across space, while I was still watching their sluggish motions in the sunlight and noting each strange detail of their form. The curate reminded me of his presence by pulling violently at my arm. I turned to a scowling face and silent, eloquent lips. He wanted the slit, which permitted only one of us to peep through, and so I had to forego watching them for a time. While he enjoyed that privilege, when I looked again, the busy handling machine had already put together several of the pieces of apparatus. It had taken out of the cylinder into a shape, having an unmistakable likeness to its own, and down on the left, a busy little digging mechanism had come into view, emitting jets of green vapor, and working its way around the pit, excavating and then banking. In a methodical and discriminating manner, this it was which had caused the regular beating noise, and the rhythmic shocks that had kept a ruinous refuge. Quivering it piped and whistles. It worked, so far as I could see. The thing was without a directing Martian at all. Chapter 3, The Days of Imprisonment, the arrival of a second fighting machine, drove us from our people into the scullery, for we feared that from his elevation, the Martian might see down upon us behind our barrier. At a later date, we began to feel less in danger of their eyes, for to an eye in the dazzle of the sunlight outside, our refuge must have been blank blackness. But at first the slightest suggestion of approach drove us into the scullery in heart-throbbing retreat. Yet terrible as was the danger we incurred, the attraction of peeping was for both of us irresistible, and I recall now with a sort of wonder that in spite of the infinite danger in which we were, between starvation and a still more terrible death, we could yet struggle bitterly for that horrible privilege of sight. We would race across the kitchen in a grotesque way, between eagerness and the dread of making a noise, and strike each other, and thrust and kick within a few inches of exposure. The fact is that we had absolutely incompatible dispositions, and habits of thought and action, and our danger and isolation only accentuated the incompatibility. At Hafford I had already come to heat the curate's trick of helpless explanation, his stupid rigidity of mind, his endless muttering monologue, vitiated every effort I made to think out a line of action, and drove me at times, thus pent up and intensified, almost to the verge of craziness. He was as lacking in restraint as a silly woman. He would weep for hours together, and I verily believe that to the very end, this spoiled child of life thought his weak tears in some way efficacious, and I would sit in the darkness, unable to keep my mind off him by reason of his opportunities. He ate more than I did, and it was in vain. I pointed out that our only chance of life was to stop in the house until the Martians had done with their pit, that in that long patience, a time might presently come when we should need food. He ate and drank impulsively, in heavy meals at long intervals. He slept little. As the days wore on, his utter carelessness of any consideration so intensified our distress and danger that I had, much as I loved doing it, to resort to threats and at last to blows that brought him to reason for a time. But he was one of those weak creatures, void of pride, timorous, anemic, hateful souls, full of shifty cunning, who face neither God nor man, who face not even themselves. It is disagreeable for me to recall and write these things, but I set them down that my story may lack nothing. Those who have escaped the dark and terrible aspects of life will find my brutality, my flash of rage in our final tragedy, easy enough to blame. For they know what is wrong as well as any, but not what is possible to torture men. But those who have been under the shadow, who have gone down at last elemental things, will have a wider charity. And while within we fought out our dark, dim contest of whispers, snatched food and drink and gripping hands and blows, without in the pitiless sunlight of that terrible June was the strange wonder, the unfamiliar routine of the Martians in the pit. Let me return to those first new experiences of mine. After a long time I ventured back to the people, to find that the newcomers had been reinforced by the occupants of no fewer than 3 of the fighting machines. These last had brought with them certain fresh appliances that stood in an orderly manner about the cylinder. The second handling machine was now completed and was busied and serving one of the novel contrivances The big machine had brought, this was a body, resembling a milk can in its general form, above which oscillated a pear-shaped receptacle, from which a stream of white powder flowed into a circular basin below. The oscillatory motion was imparted to this by one tentacle of the handling machine with two spatulate hands. The handling machine was digging out and flinging masses of clay into the pear-shaped receptacle above, while with another arm, it periodically opened the door and removed rusty and blackened clinkers. From the middle part of the machine, another steely tentacle directed the powder from the basin along a ribbed channel towards some receiver that was hidden from me by the mound of bluish dust. From this unseen receiver, a little thread of green smoke rose vertically into the quiet air. As I looked, the handling machine, with faint and musical clinking, extended telescopic fashion, a tentacle that had been, a moment before, a mere blunt projection until its end was hidden behind the mound of clay. In another second, it had lifted a bar of white aluminium intersight, untarnished as yet and shining dazzlingly, and deposited it in a growing stack of bars that stood at the side of the pit. Between sunset and starlight, this dexterous machine must have made more than 100 such bars out of the crude clay, and the mound of bluish dust rose steadily until it topped the side of the pit. The contrast between the swift and complex movements of these contrivances and the inert, panting clumsiness of their masters was acute, and for days I had to tell myself repeatedly that these latter were indeed the living of the two things. The curate had possession of the slit. When the first men were brought to the pit, I was sitting below, huddled up, listening with all my ears. He made a sudden movement backward, and I, fearful that we were observed, crouched in a spasm of terror. He came sliding down the rubbish and crept beside me in the darkness, inarticulate, gesticulating. And for the moment I shared his panic. His gesture suggested a resignation of the slit. And after a little while my curiosity gave me courage, and I rose up, stepped across him, and clambered up to it. At first, I could see no reason for his frantic behavior. The twilight had no come, the stars were little and faint, but the pit was illuminated by the flickering green fire that came from the aluminium making. The whole picture was a flickering scheme of green, glimpse and shifting rusty black shadows, strangely trying to the eyes. Over and through it all went the bat, heading it not at all. The sprawling Martians were no longer to be seen. The mound of blue-green powder had risen to cover them from sight, and a fighting machine with its legs contracted, crumpled and abbreviated, stood across the corner of the pit. And then amid the clangor of the machinery came a drifting suspicion of human voices that I entertained at first only to dismiss. I crouched watching this fighting machine closely, satisfying myself, for the first time, that the hood did indeed contain a Martian. As the green flames lifted, I could see the oily gleam of his integument and the brightness of his eyes. And suddenly I heard a yell and saw a long tentacle reaching over the shoulder of the machine to the little cage that hunched upon its back. Then something struggling violently was lifted high against the sky, a black vague enigma against the starlight. And as this black object came down again, I saw by the green brightness that it was a man. For an instant he was clearly visible. He was a stout, ruddy, middle-aged man, well-dressed. 3 days before he must have been walking the world. A man of considerable consequence. I could see his staring eyes and gleams of light on his studs and watch chain. He vanished behind the mound, and for a moment there was silence, and then began a shrieking and a sustained and cheerful hooting from the Martians. I slid down the rubbish, struggled to my feet, clapped my hands over my ears, and bolted into the scullery. The curate, who had been crouching silently, with his arms over his head, looked up as I passed, cried out quite loudly at my desertion of him, and came running after me. That night, as we lurked in the scullery, balanced between our horror and the terrible fascination this peeping had, although I felt an urgent need of action, I tried in vain to conceive some plan of escape. But afterwards, during the second day, I was able to consider our position. With great clearness, the curate I found was quite incapable of discussion. This new and culminating atrocity had robbed him of all vestiges of reason or forethought. Practically, he had already sunk to the level of an animal. But as the saying goes, I gripped myself with both hands. It grew up on my mind once I could face the fact that, terrible as our position was, there was as yet no justification for absolute despair. Our chief chance lay in the possibility of the Martians making the pit nothing more than a temporary encampment, or even if they kept it permanently, they might not consider it necessary to guard it, and a chance of escape might be afforded us. I also weighed very carefully the possibility of our digging away, out in a direction away from the pit. But the chances of our emerging within sight of some sentinel fighting machine seemed at first too great, and I should have had to do all the digging myself. The curate would certainly have failed me. It was on the third day, if my memory serves me right, that I saw the lad killed. It was the only occasion on which I actually saw the Martians feed. After that experience, I avoided the hole in the wall. For the better part of the day, I went into the scullery, removed the door, and spent some hours digging with my hatchet, as silently as possible. But when I had made a hole about a couple of feet deep, the loose earth collapsed noisily, and I did not dare continue. I lost heart, and lay down on the scullery floor for a long time, having no spirit even to move, and after that I abandoned altogether the idea of escaping by excavation. It says much for the impression the Martians had made upon me that, at first, I entertained little or no hope of our escape being brought about by their overthrow through any human effort. But on the fourth or fifth night, I heard a sound like heavy guns. It was very late in the night, and the moon was shining brightly. The Martians had taken away the excavating machine, and save for the fighting machine that stood in the remoter bank of the pit, and a handling machine that was buried out of my sight in a corner of the pit. Immediately beneath my people, the place was deserted by them, except for the pale glow from the handling machine and the bars and patches of white moonlight. The pit was in darkness, and except for the clinking of the handling machine, quite still. The night was a beautiful serenity. See, for one planet, the moon seemed to have the sky to herself. I heard a dog howling, and that familiar sound it was that made me listen. Then I heard quite distinctly a booming, exactly like the sound of great guns. 6 distinct reports I counted, and after a long interval 6 again, and that was all. Chapter 4. The Death of the Curate. It was on the 6th day of our imprisonment that I peeped for the last time, and presently found myself alone. Instead of keeping close to me and trying to oust me from the slit, the curate had gone back into the scullery. I was struck by a sudden thought. I went back quickly and quietly into the scullery. In the darkness, I heard the curate drinking. I snatched in the darkness, and my fingers caught a bottle of Burgundy. For a few minutes there was a tussle. The bottle struck the floor and broke, and I desisted and rose. We stood panting and threatening each other. In the end, I planted myself between him and the food, and told him of my determination to begin a discipline. I divided the food in the pantry into rations. To last us 10 days, I would not let him eat any more. That day in the afternoon, he made a feeble effort to get to the food. I had been dozing, but in an instant, I was awake all day, and all night we sat face to face, I weary but resolute, and he weeping and complaining of his immediate hunger. It was, I know, a night in the day, but to me it seems now an interminable length of time. And so our widened incompatibility ended at last in open conflict for 2 vast days. We struggled in undertones and wrestling contests. There were times when I beat and kicked him madly, times when I cajoled and persuaded him, and once I tried to bribe him with the last bottle of Burgundy, for there was a rainwater pump from which I could get water. But neither force nor kindness availed. He was indeed beyond reason. He would neither desist from his attacks on the food, nor from his noisy babbling to himself. The rudimentary precautions to keep our imprisonment in, durable he would not observe. Slowly I began to realize the complete overthrow of his intelligence. To perceive that my sole companion, in this close and sickly darkness, was a man unseen from certain vague memories. I'm inclined to think my own mind wandered at times. I had strange and hideous dreams whenever I slept. It sounds paradoxical, but I'm inclined to think that the weakness and insanity of the curate warned me, breezed me, and kept me a sane man. On the 8th day, he began to talk aloud instead of whispering, and nothing I could do with moderate a speech. "It is just, O God," he would say over and over again. "It is just on me, and mine be the punishment laid. We have sinned, we have fallen short. There was poverty, sorrow. The poor were trodden in the dust, and I held my peace, I preached acceptable folly. My God, what folly, when I should have stood up, though I died for it, and called upon them to repent. Repent, oppressors of the poor and needy." The wine press of God. Then he was suddenly revert to the matter of the food I withheld from him. Praying, begging, weeping, at last threatening, he began to raise his voice. I prayed him not to. He perceived a hold on me. He threatened. He would shout and bring the Martians upon us. For a time that scared me, but any concession would have shortened our chance of escape beyond estimating. I defied him, although I felt no assurance that he might not do this thing. But that day, at any rate, he did not. He talked with his voice rising slowly. Through the greater part of the 8th and 9th days, threats, entreaties, mingled with a torrent of half-seen and always frothy repentance for his vacant sham of God's service, such as made me pity him. Then he slept a while, and began again with renewed strength, so loudly that I must need to make him desist. "Be still," I implored. He rose to his knees, for he had been sitting in the darkness near the copper. "I have been still too long," he said in a tournament. "Must have reached the pit, and now I must bear my witness. Woe unto this unfaithful city, woe, 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 to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet." "Shut up," I said, rising to my feet, and in a terror, lest the Martian should hear us. "For God's sake, nay," shouted the curate at the top of his voice, standing likewise and extending his arms. "Speak, the word of the Lord is upon me." In 3 straight. He was at the door leading into the kitchen. "I must bear my witness, I go. It has already been too long delayed." I put out my hand and felt the meat chopper hanging to the wall. In a flash I was after him. I was fierce with fear. Before he was halfway across the kitchen, I had overtaken him with one last touch of humanity. I turned the blade back and struck him with the butt. He went headlong forward and lay stretched on the ground. I stumbled over him and stood panting. He lay still. Suddenly I heard a noise without the run and smash of slipping plaster, and the triangular aperture in the wall was darkened. I looked up and saw the lower surface of a handling machine. Coming slowly across the hole, one of its gripping limbs curled, and at the debris another limb appeared. Feeling its way over the fallen beams, I stood petrified, staring. Then I saw through a sort of glass plate, near the edge of the body, the face as we may call it, and the large dark eyes of a Martian peering, and then a long metallic snake of tentacle came. Feeling slowly through the hole, I turned by an effort, stumbled over the curate, and stopped at the scullery door. The tentacle was now some way, 2 yards or more in the room, and twisting and turning with queer, sudden movements this way and that. For a while I stood fascinated by that slow, fitful advance. Then with a faint hoarse cry, I forced myself across the scullery. I trembled violently. I could scarcely stand upright. I opened the door of the coal cellar and stood there in the darkness, staring at the faintly lit doorway into the kitchen, and listening. Had the Martian see me? What was it doing now? Something was moving to and through there very quietly. Every now and then it tapped against the wall, or started on its movements with a faint, metallic ringing, like the movements of keys on a split ring. Then a heavy body I knew too well, what was dragged across the floor of the kitchen, towards the opening irresistibly attracted. I crept to the door and peeped into the kitchen. In the triangle of bright outer sunlight, I saw the Martian, and its bright areas of a handling machine, scrutinizing the curate's head. I thought at once that it would infer my presence. From the mark of the blue I'd given him, I crept back to the cal cellar, shut the door, and began to cover myself up as much as I could, and as noiselessly as possible in the darkness, among the firewood and cool therein. Every now and then I paused, rigid to hear if the Martian had thrust its tentacles through the opening again. Then the faint metallic jingle returned. I traced it slowly, feeling over the kitchen. Presently I heard it nearer in the scullery. As I judged, I thought that its length might be insufficient to reach me. I prayed copiously it passed, scraping faintly across the cellar door. An age of almost intolerable suspense intervened. Then I heard it fumbling at the latch. It had found the door. The Martians understood doors. It worried that the catch for a minute perhaps. And then the door opened. In the darkness I could just see the thing, like an elephant's trunk more than anything else, weaving towards me and touching and examining the walls, coals, wood, and ceiling. It was like a black worm, swinging its blind head to and fro. Once even it touched the heel of my boot. I was on the verge of screaming. I bit my hand for a time. The tentacle was silent. I could have fancied it had been withdrawn. Presently, with an abrupt click, it gripped something I thought it had me, and seemed to go out of the cellar again. For a minute, I was not sure. Apparently, it had taken a lump of coal to examine. I seized the opportunity of slightly shifting my position, which had become cramped, and then listened. I whispered passionate prayers for safety. Then I heard the slow, deliberate sound creeping towards me again slowly. Slowly it drew near, scratching against the walls and tapping the furniture. While I was still doubtful, it rapped smartly against the cellar door and closed it. I heard it going to the pantry, and the biscuit tins rattled and a bottle smashed. And then came a heavy bump against the cellar door. Then silence that passed into an infinity of suspense. Had it gone? At last I decided that it had. It came into the scullery no more. But I lay all the 10th day in the close darkness, buried among coals and firewood, not daring even to crawl out for the drink, for which I craved. It was the 11th day before I ventured. So far from my security. Chapter 5, The Stillness. My first act before I went into the pantry was to fasten the door between the kitchen and the scullery, but the pantry was empty. Every scrap of food had gone. Apparently, the Martian had taken it all on the previous day. At that discovery I disappeared. For the first time I took no food or no drink, either on the 11th or the 12th day. At first my mouth and throat were parched, and my strength ebbed sensibly. I sat about in the darkness of the scullery, in a state of despondent wretchedness. My mind ran on eating. I thought I had become deaf, for the noises of movement I had been accustomed to hear from the pit had ceased absolutely. I did not feel strong enough to crawl noiselessly to the people, or I would have gone there. On the 12th day my throat was so painful that, taking the chance of alarming the Martians, I attacked the creaking rainwater pump that stood by the sink and got a couple of glassfuls of blackened and tainted rainwater. I was greatly refreshed by this, and emboldened by the fact that no inquiring tentacle followed the noise of my pumping during these days in a rambling, inconclusive way. I thought much of the curate and of the manner of his death. On the 13th day I drank some more water and dozed, and thought disjointedly of eating and of vague, impossible plans of escape. Whenever I dosed I dreamt of horrible phantasms, of the death of the curate, or of sumptuous dinners, but asleep or awake. I felt a keen pain that urged me to drink again. And again, the light that came into the scullery was no longer gray but red to my disordered imagination. It seemed the color of blood. On the 14th day I went into the kitchen, and I was surprised to find that the fronds of the red weed had grown right across the hole in the wall, turning the half-light of the place into a crimson-colored obscurity. It was early on the 10th day that I heard a curious, familiar sequence of sounds in the kitchen, and listening, identified it as the snuffing and scratching of a dog. Going into the kitchen, I saw a dog's nose peering in through a break among the ruddy thrones. This greatly surprised me at the scent of me. He barked shortly, I thought. If I could induce him to come into the place quietly, I should be able perhaps to kill and eat him. And in any case, it would be advisable to kill him, lest his actions attracted the attention of the Martians. I crept forward saying, "Good dog," very softly. But he suddenly withdrew his head and disappeared. I listened. I was not deaf, but certainly the pit was still. I heard a sound like the flutter of a bird's wings, and a horse crooking, but that was all. For a long while I lay close to the people, but not daring to move aside the red plants that obscured it. Once or twice I had a faint pitter-patter, like the feet of the dog going heather and feather on the sand far below me. And there were more bird lake signs, but that was all at length. Encouraged by the silence, I looked out, except in the corner where a multitude of crews hopped and fought over the skeletons of the dead the Martians had consumed. There was not a living thing in the pit. I stared about me, scarcely believing my eyes. All the machinery had gone see. For the big mound of grayish-blue powder in one corner, certain bars of aluminium in another, the black birds, and the skeletons of the killed. The place was merely an empty circular pit in the sand. Slowly I thrust myself out through the red weed and stood upon the mound of rubble. I could see in any direction. Safe behind me to the north, and neither Martians nor sign of Martians were to be seen. The pit dropped sheerly from my feet, but a little way along the rubbish afforded a practical slope to the summit of the ruins. My chance of escape had come. I began to tremble. I hesitated for some time, and then in a gust of desperate resolution, and with a heart that throbbed violently, I scrambled to the top of the mound in which I had been buried so long. I looked about again to the northward too. No Martian was visible. When I had last seen this part of Sheen in the daylight, it had been a straggling street of comfortable white and red houses, interspersed with abundant shady trees. No, I stood on a mound of smashed brickwork, clay and gravel over which spread a multitude of red, cactus-shaped plants knee-high, without a solitary terrestrial growth to dispute their footing. The trees near me were dead and brown, but farther, a network of red thread scaled the still living stems. The neighboring houses had all been wrecked, but none had been burned. Their walls stood, sometimes to the second story, with smashed windows and shattered doors. The redweed grew tumultuously in their ruthless rooms. Below me was the great pit, with the crews struggling for its refuse. A number of other birds hopped about among the ruins. Far away, I saw a gaunt cat slink crouchingly along a wall, but traces of men there were none. The day seemed by contrast with my recent confinement. Dazzlingly bright, the sky a glowing blue. A gentle breeze kept the redweed that covered every scrap of unoccupied ground gently swaying, and oh, the sweetness of the air. Chapter 6, The Work of 15 Days. For some time, I stood torturing on the mound regardless of my safety. Within that noisome dawn from which I had emerged, I had thought, with a narrow intensity, only of our immediate security. I had not realized what had been happening to the world, had not anticipated this startling vision. Of unfamiliar things, I had expected to see Sheen in ruins. I found about me the landscape, weird and lurid, of another planet. For that moment, I touched an emotion beyond the common range of men, yet one that the poor brutes we dominate know only too well. I felt as a rabbit might feel returning to his burrow, and suddenly confronted by the work of a dozen busy navvies, digging the foundations of a house. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind, that oppressed me for days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals, under the Martian hue, With us it would be as with them to lurk and watch, to run and hide. The fear and empire of man had passed away. But so soon as this strangeness had been realized, it passed, and my dominant motive became the hunger of my long and dismal fast in the direction away from the pit. I saw beyond the red-covered wall a patch of garden ground unburied. This gave me a hint, and I went knee-deep, and sometimes neck-deep in the redweed. The density of the weed gave me a reassuring sense of hiding. The wall was some 6 feet high, and when I attempted to clamber it, I found I could not lift my feet to the crest. So I went along by the side of it and came to a corner and a rock work that enabled me to get to the top and tumble into the garden I coveted. Here I found some young onions, a couple of gladiolus bulbs, and a quantity of immature carrots, all of which I secured, and scrambling over a ruined wall, went on my way through scarlet and crimson trees. Towards Q it was like walking through an avenue of gigantic blood drops, possessed with 2 ideas: to get more food and to limp as soon. And as far as my strength permitted, out of this accursed unearthly region of the pit, some way farther, in a grassy place, was a group of mushrooms, which also I devoured, and then I came upon a brown sheet of flowing, shallow water where meadows used to be. These fragments of nourishment served only to whet my hunger. At first I was surprised at this flood in a hot, dry summer, but afterwards I discovered that it was caused by the tropical exuberance of the red weed. Directly this extraordinary growth encountered water, it straightway became gigantic and of unparalleled fecundity. Its seeds were simply poured down into the water of the Wey and Thames, and its swiftly growing and titanic water fronds speedily choked both those rivers. At Putney, as I afterward saw, the bridge was almost lost in a tangle of this weed. And at Richmond to the Thames water poured in, a broad and shallow stream. Across the meadows of Hampton and Twickenham, as the water spread, the weed followed them, until the ruined villas of the Thames Valley were, for a time, lost in this red swamp, whose margin I explored. And much of the desolation the Martians had caused was concealed. In the end, the redweed succumbed, almost as quickly as it had spread. A cankering disease, due it is believed to the action of certain bacteria, presently seized upon it. Now by the action of natural selection, all terrestrial plants have acquired a resisting power. Against bacterial diseases, they never succumb without a severe struggle. But the redweed rotted like a thing already dead. The fronds became bleached and then shriveled and brittle. They broke off at the least touch. And the waters that had stimulated their early growth carried their last vestiges out to sea. My first act on coming to this water was, of course, to slake my thirst. I drank a great deal of it, and moved by an impulse, gnawed some fronds of redweed. But they were watery, and as a sickly metallic taste, I found. The water was sufficiently shallow for me to wade securely, although the redweed impeded my feet a little. But the flood evidently got deeper towards the river, and I turned back to Mortlake. I managed to make out the road, by means of occasional ruins of its villas, and fences and lamps, and so presently I got out of this speed and made my way to the hill, going up towards Roehampton, and came out on Putney Common. Here, the scenery changed from the strange and unfamiliar to the wreckage of the familiar. Patches of ground exhibited the devastation of a cyclone, and in a few score yards, I would come upon perfectly undisturbed spaces, houses with their blinds trimly drawn and doors closed, as if they've been left for a day by the owners, or as if their inhabitants slept within. The redweed was less abundant. The tall trees along the lane were free from the red creeper. I hunted for food among the trees, finding nothing. And I also raided a couple of silent houses, but they had already been broken into and ransacked. I rested for the remainder of the daylight, in a strawberry being in mind-feebled condition, too fatigued to push on at this time. I saw no human beings and no signs of the Martians. I encountered a couple of hungry-looking dogs, but both hurried circuitously away from the advances. I made them. Near Roehampton, I had seen two human skeletons. Not bodies, but skeletons picked clean, and in the wood by me I found the crushed and scattered bones of several cats and rabbits and the skull of a sheep, but though I gnawed parts of these in my mouth, there was nothing to be got from them. After sunset I struggled on along the road towards Putney when I think the heat ray must have been used for some reason, and in the garden beyond Roehampton I got a quantity of immature potatoes, sufficient to steam my hunger from this garden. One looked down upon Putney and the river. The aspect of the place in the dusk was singularly desolate, blackened trees, black and desolate ruins, and down the hill the sheets of the flooded river, red tinged with the weed and overall silence. It filled me with indescribable terror to think how swiftly that desolating change had come for a time. I believed that mankind had been swept out of existence, and that I stood there alone, the last man left alive. Hard by the top of Putney Hill, I came upon another skeleton, with the arms dislocated and removed several yards from the rest of the body. As I proceeded, I became more and more convinced that the extermination of mankind, wars save for such stragglers as myself, already accomplished in this part of the world. The Martians, I thought, had gone on and left the country desolated, seeking food elsewhere. Perhaps even now they were destroying Berlin or Paris, or it might be they had gone northward. Chapter 7. The Man on Putney Hill. I spent that night in the inn that stands at the top of Putney Hill, sleeping in a made bed. For the first time since my flight to Leatherhead, I will not tell the needless trouble I had breaking into that house afterwards. I found the front door was on the latch, nor how I ransacked every room for food until just on the verge of despair. In what seemed to me to be a servant's bedroom, I found a ratnod crust and 2 tins of pineapple. The place had been already searched and emptied. In the bar I afterwards found some biscuits and sandwiches that had been overlooked. The latter I could not eat. They were too rotten, but the former not only stayed my hunger, but filled my pockets. I lit no lamps, fearing some Martian might come, beating that part of London for food. In the night before I went to bed, I had an interval of restlessness, and prowled from window to window, peering out for some sign of these monsters. I slept little. As I lay in bed I found myself thinking consecutively, a thing I do not remember to have done since my last argument with the curate during all the intervening time. My mental condition had been a hurrying succession of vague emotional state, or sort of stupid receptivity, but in the night my brain, reinforced I suppose by the food I had eaten, grew clear again, and I thought 3 things: struggle for possession of my mind, the killing of the curate, the whereabouts of the Martians, and the possible fate of my wife. The former gave me no sensation of horror or remorse. To recall, I saw it simply as a thing done, a memory infinitely disagreeable, but quite without the quality of remorse. I saw myself then as I see myself now, driven step by step towards that hasty blow, the creature of a sequence of accidents, leading inevitably to that. I felt no condemnation, yet the memory static, unprogressive, haunted me in the silence of the night, with that sense of the nearness of God that sometimes comes into the stillness. And the darkness, I stood my trial, my only trial for that moment of wrath and fear. I retraced every step of our conversation from the moment when I had found him, crouching beside me heedless of my thirst and pointing to the fire and smoke that streamed up from the ruins of Weybridge. We had been incapable of cooperation. Grim chance had taken no heed of that. Had I foreseen, I should have left him at Halliford, But I did not foresee, and crime is to foresee and do. And I set this down, as I have set all the story down as it was. There were no witnesses. All these things I might have concealed, but I set it down. And the reader must form his judgment as he will, and when by an effort. I had set aside that picture of a prostrate body. I faced the problem of the Martians, and defeated my wife. For the former, I had no data. I could imagine 100 things. And so unhappily I could for the latter, and suddenly that night became terrible. I found myself sitting up in bed staring at the dark. I found myself praying that the heat ray might have suddenly and painlessly struck her out of being since the night of my return from Leatherhead. I had not prayed, I had uttered prayers. Fetish prayers had prayed, as heathens mutter charms when I was in extremity. But now I prayed indeed, pleading steadfastly and sanely, face to face with the darkness of God. Strange night. Strangest in this that as soon as dawn had come, I who had talked with God crept out of the house like a rat, leaving its hiding place a creature scarcely larger, an inferior animal, a thing that for any passing whim of her masters might be hunted and killed. Perhaps they also prayed confidently to God. Surely, if we have learned nothing else, this war has taught us pity. Pity for those witless souls that suffer our dominion. The morning was bright and fine, and the eastern sky glowed pink, and was fretted with little golden clouds. In the road that runs from the top of Putney Hill to Wimbledon was a number of poor vestiges of the panic torrent that must have poured London word on the Sunday night after the fighting began. There was a little-to-wheeled cart, inscribed with the name of Thomas Lobb, greengrocer, New Malden, with a smashed wheel and an abandoned tin trunk. There was a straw hat trampled into the no-hardened mud, and at the top of West Hill, a lot of blood-stained glass about the overturned water trough. My movements were language, my plans of the vaguest. I had an idea of going to Leatherhead, though I knew that there I had the poorest chance of finding my wife, certainly, unless death had overtaken them suddenly. My cousins and she would have fled Vans, but it seemed to me I might find or land there. Whether the sorry people had fled, I knew I wanted to find my wife, that my heart ached for her and the world of man. But I had no clear idea how the finding might be done. I was also sharply aware now of my intense loneliness from the corner. I went under cover of a thicket of trees and bushes to the edge of Wimbledon Common, stretching wide and far. That dark expanse was lit in patches by yellow gorse and broom. There was no red weeds to be seen, and as I prowled hesitating on the verge of the open, the sun rose flooding it all with light and vitality. I came upon a busy swarm of little frogs. In a swampy place among the trees, I stopped to look at them, drawing a lesson from their stout resolve to live, and presently turning suddenly, with an odd feeling of being watched, I beheld something crouching amid a clump of bushes. I stood regarding this. I made a step towards it, and it rose up and became a man armed with a cutlass. I approached him slowly. He stood silent and motionless regarding me. As I drew nearer, I perceived he was dressed in clothes as dusty and filthy as my own. He looked indeed as though he had been dragged through a culvert. Nearer, I distinguished the green slime of ditches, mixing with the peeled drab of dried, clear and shiny coulee patches. His black hair fell over his eyes, and his face was dark and dirty and sunken, so that at first I did not recognize him. There was a red cut across the lower part of his face. "Stop," he cried, when I was within 10 yards of him, and I stopped. His voice was hoarse. "Where do you come from?" he said. I thought, surveying him. "I come from Mortlake," I said. "I was buried near the pit. The Martians made about their cylinder. I've worked my way out and escaped. There's no food about here." He said, "This is my country. All this hill down to the river. And back to Clapham and up to the edge of the common, there is only food for one. Which way are you going? I answered slowly. I don't know, I said. I have been buried in the ruins of a house, 13 or 14 days, I don't know what has happened. He looked at me doubtfully, then started and looked with a changed expression. I've no wish to stop about here, said I think I should go to Leatherhead. For my wife was there. He shot out a pointing finger. It is you, City, the man from Walking. And you weren't killed at Weybridge. I recognized him at the same moment. You are the artillery man who came into my garden. Good luck, he said. We are lucky ones, fancy you. He put out a hand and I took it. I crawled up a drain, he said. But they didn't kill everyone. And after they went away, I got off towards Walton, across the fields. But it's not 16 days altogether, and your hair is gray. He looked over his shoulder. Suddenly only a rook, he said. One gets to know that birds have shadows these days. This is a bit open. Let us crawl under those bushes and talk. Have you seen any Martians? I said since I crawled out. They've gone away across London, he said. I guess they've got a bigger camp there of a night, all over their Hampstead way. The sky is alive with their light, is like a great city. And in the glare you can just see them moving. By daylight you can't, but nearer I haven't seen them. He counted as his fingers 5 days. Then I saw a couple across Hammersmith Way, carrying something big, and the night before last. He stopped and spoke impressively. It was just a matter of lights. But it was something up in the air. I believe they've built a flying machine. And are learning to fly. I stopped on hands and knees. For we had come to the bush. Fly, yes. He said fly. I went on into a little bower and sat down. It is all over with humanity. I said, if they can do that, they will simply go round the world. He noted they will. But it will relieve things over here a bit. And besides, he looked at me. Are you satisfied it is up with humanity? I am. We're down. We're beat. I stared. Strange as it may seem, I had not arrived at this fact. A fact perfectly obvious so soon as he spoke. I had still held a vague hope. Rather, I had kept a lifelong habit of mind. He repeated his words, we are beat. They carried absolute conviction. It is all over, he said. They've lost one, just one. And they've made their footing good. And crippled the greatest power in the world. They've walked over us. The death of that one at Weybridge was an accident. And these are only pioneers. They kept on coming, these green stars. I've seen none these 5 or 6 days. But I've no doubt they're falling somewhere every night. Nothing's to be done, we're under, we are beat. I made him no answer. I sat staring before me, trying in vain to devise some countervailing thought. This isn't a war, said the artillery man. It never was a war. Any more than there's war between man and ants. Suddenly I recall the night in the observatory. After the 10th shot they fired no more. At least until the first cylinder came. How do you know, said the artillery man. I explained he thought something wrong with the gun. He said, but what if there is? They'll get it right again. And even if there's a delay, how can it alter the end? It's just men and ants. There's the ants build their cities, live their lives, have wars, revolutions until the men want them out of the way. And then they go out of the way. That's what we are now, just ants only. Yes, I said, we are eatable ants. We sat looking at each other. And what will they do with us? I said, that's what I've been thinking. He said, that's what I've been thinking. After Weybridge I went south, thinking I saw what was up. Most of the people were hard at it, squealing and exciting themselves. But I'm not so fond of squealing. I've been inside of death once or twice. I'm not an ornamental soldier. And at the best and worst death, it's just death. And it's the man that keeps on thinking comes through. I saw everyone tracking away south. Says I food won't last that way, and I turned right back. I went for the Martians like a sparrow goes for man, All round he waved a hand to the horizon. They're starving in heaps, bolting, treading on each other. He saw my face and halted awkwardly. No doubt lots who had money have gone away to France. He said he seemed to hesitate whether to apologize. Met my eyes and went on, there's food all about here. Hand things in shops, wines, spirits, mineral waters. And the water mains and drains are empty. Well, I was telling you what I was thinking. He's intelligent things, I said, and it seems they want us for food. First they'll smash us up, ships, machines, guns. Cities, all the order and organization. All that will go. If we were the size of ants, we might pull through, but we're not. It's all too bulky to stop. That's the first certainty, eh? I assented, it is. I've thought it out very well. Then next, at present, we're caught as we're wanted. A Martian has only to go a few miles to get a crowd on the run. And I saw one day out by Wandsworth, picking houses to pieces and rooting among the wreckage. But they won't keep on doing that. So soon as they've settled all our guns and ships and smashed our railways and done all the things they are doing over there, they will begin catching us systematic, picking the best and storing us in cages and things. That's what they will start doing in a bit. Lord, they haven't begun on us yet. Don't you see that? Not begun, I exclaimed. Not begun. All that's happened so far is through. Are not having a sense to keep quiet, worrying them with guns and such foolery, and losing our heads and rushing off in crowds to where there wasn't any more safety than where we were. They don't want to bother us yet. They're making their things, making all the things they couldn't bring with them, getting things ready for the rest of their people, very likely. That's why the cylinders have stopped for a bit, the fear of hitting those who are here. And instead of our rushing about blind on the howl, or getting dynamite on the chance of busting them up, we've got to fix ourselves up, according to the new state of affairs. That's how I figured it out. It isn't quite according to what a man wants for his species, but it's about what the fact point to. And that's the principle I acted upon. Cities, nations, civilization, progress, it's all over. That game's up, we're beat. But if that is so, what is there to live for? The artillery man looked at me for a moment. There won't be any more blessed concerts for 1,000,000 years or so. There won't be any Royal Academy of Arts. And no nice little feeds at restaurants. If it's amusement you're after, I reckon the game is up. If you got any drawing room manners, or a dislike to eating peas with a knife, or dropping ages, you better chuck them away. They ain't no further use. You mean that men like me are going on living for the sake of the breed. I tell you, I'm grim set on living. And if I'm not mistaken, you show what inside you've got, to before long. We aren't going to be exterminated, and I don't mean to be caught either, and tamed and fattened and bred like a thundering ox. Ooh, fancy those brown creepers. You don't mean to say I do. I'm going on under their feet. I've got it planned, I've thought it out. We men are beat, we don't know enough. We've got to learn before we got a chance. And we've got to live and keep independent while we learn. See, that's what has to be done. I stared astonished and starred profoundly by the man's resolution. Great God, cried I, but you are a man indeed. And suddenly I gripped his hand. Hey, he said with his eyes shining. I thought it out, hey. Go on, I said. Well, those who mean to escape their catching must get ready. I'm getting ready, mind you. It isn't all of us that are made for wild beasts. And that's what it's got to be. That's why I watched you. I have my doubts. You're slender, I didn't know that it was you. You see, or just how he'd been buried, all these. The sort of people that lived in these houses. And all those damn little clerks that used to live down that way. They'd be no good, they haven't any spirit in them. No proud dreams and no proud lusts, and a man who hasn't one or the other. Lord, what is he but funk and precautions? They just used to skedaddle off to work. I've seen hundreds of them. Bit of breakfast in hand, running wild and shining to catch their little season ticket train, for fear they'd get dismissed if they didn't, working at businesses. They were afraid to take the trouble to understand, skedaddling back for fear they wouldn't be in time for dinner, keeping indoors after dinner for fear of the backstreets, and sleeping with the wives they married, not because they wanted them, but because they had a bit of money. That would make for safety in their one little miserable skedaddle through the world. Lives insured and a bit invested for fear of accidents. And on Sundays, fear of the hereafter, as if hell was built for rabbits. Well, the Martians will just be a godsend to these nice, roomy cages, fattening food. Careful breathing, no worry, after a week or so. Chasing about the fields and lands on empty stomachs, they'll come and be caught cheerful. They'll be quite glad after a bit. They'll wonder what people did before. There were Martians to take care of them, and the bar loafers and mashes. And singers, I can imagine them, he said. With a sort of somber gratification, there'll be any amount of sentiment and religion. Loose among them, there's hundreds of things I saw with my eyes, that I've only begun to see clearly these last few days. There's lots will take things as they are, fat and stupid, and lots will be worried by sort of feeling that it's all wrong, and that they ought to be doing something. Now whenever things are so bad, a lot of people feel they ought to be doing something. The weak and those who go weak, with a lot of complicated thinking, always make for a sort of do-nothing religion, very pious and superior, and submit to persecution and the will of the Lord. Very likely you've seen the same thing. It's energy in a gale of funk and turned clean inside out. These cages will be full of psalms and hymns and piety, and those of a less simple sort will work in a bit of, what is it, eroticism? He paused very lightly. These Martians will make pets of some of them, train them to do tricks, who knows, get sentimental over the pet boy who grew up and had to be killed, and some maybe they will train to hunt us. No, I cried, that's impossible, no human being. What's the good of going on with such lies, said the artillery man. There's men who do it cheerful. What nonsense to pretend there isn't, and I succumbed to his conviction. If they come after me, he said, Lord, if they come after me, and subsided into a grim meditation. I sat contemplating these things. I could find nothing to bring against this man's reasoning in the days before the invasion. No. One would have questioned my intellectual superiority to his, a professed and recognized writer on philosophical themes, and he a common soldier, and yet he had already formulated a situation that I had scarcely realized. What are you doing? I said presently. What plans have you made? He hesitated. Well, it's like this, he said. What have we to do? We have to invent a sort of life where men can live and breed, and be sufficiently secure to bring the children up. Yes, wait a bit, and I'll make it clearer what I think ought to be done. The tame ones will go like all tame beasts. In a few generations they'll be big, beautiful, rich-blooded, stupid rubbish. The risk is that we who keep wild will go savage, degenerate into a sort of big savage rat. You see how I mean to live as underground. I've been thinking about the drains, of course. Those who don't know drains think horrible things. But under this London are miles and miles, hundreds of miles, and a few days' rain and London empty. We'll leave them sweet and clean. The main drains are big enough and airy enough for anyone. Then they're cellars, vaults, stores from which bolting passages may be made to the drains and the railway tunnels and subways. Hey, you begin to see, and we form a band, able-bodied, clean-minded men. We're not gonna pick up any rubbish that drifts in. Weaklings go out again as you meant me to go. Well, I parlayed, didn't I? We won't call about that. Go on those who stop, obey orders, able-bodied, clean-minded women. We want also mothers and teachers. No lackadaisical ladies, no blasted rolling eyes. We can't have any weak or silly. Life is real again, and the useless and cumbersome and mischievous have to die. They ought to die, they ought to be willing to die. It's a sort of disloyalty after all. To live and taint the race, and they can't be happy. Moreover, dying's not so dreadful, it's the funking makes it bad. And in all those places we shall gather. Our district will be London, and we may even be able to keep a watch and run about in the open when the Martians keep away. Play cricket perhaps, that's how we shall save the race. Hey, it's a possible thing, but saving the race is nothing in itself. As I say, that's only being rats. It's saving our knowledge and adding to it is the thing. There are men like you come in, there's books, there's models. We must make great safe places down deep and get all the books we can. Not novels and poetry swipes, but ideas, science books. That's where men like you come in. We must go to the British Museum and pick all those books through. Especially we must keep up our science. Learn more, we must watch these Martians. Some of us must go as spies. When it's all working, perhaps I will get caught. And the great thing is we must leave the Martians alone. We mustn't even steal if we get in their way. We clear out, we must show them we mean no harm. Yes, I know, but they're intelligent things. And they won't hunt us down if they have all they want. And think we're just harmless vermin. The artilleryman paused and laid a brown hand upon my arm. After all, it may not be so much we have to learn before. Just imagine this, for 5 of their fighting machines, suddenly starting off heat raised right and left. And not a Martian in them, not a Martian in them, but men. Men who have learned the way, how it may be in my time. Even those men fancy having one of them. Lovely things with its heat ray wide and free, fancy having it in control. What would it matter if you smashed to smithereens? At the end of the run, after a bus like that, I reckon the Martians will open their beautiful eyes. Can't you see the man, can't you see them hurrying? Hurrying, puffing, and blowing and hooting. To the other mechanical affairs. Something out of gear in every case, and swish, bang, rattle. Swish just as they're fumbly over it. Swish comes the heat ray, and behold, man has come back to his own, for a while. The imaginative daring of the artilleryman, and the tone of assurance and courage he assumed, completely dominated my mind. I believed unhesitatingly, both in his forecast of human destiny, and in the practical ability of his astonishing scheme. And the reader who thinks me susceptible and foolish must contrast his position, reading steadily, with all his thoughts about his subject and mind, crouching fearfully in the bushes and listening, distracted by apprehension. We talked in this manner through the early morning time, and later crept out of the bush, and after scanning the sky for Martians, hurried precipitately to the house on Putney Hill, where he had made his lair. It was the coal sailor of the place, and when I saw the work he had spent a week upon, it was a burrow scarcely 10 yards long, which he designed. To reach to the main drain on Putney Hill, I had my first inkling of the gulf between his dreams and his powers, such a hole I could have dug in a day. But I believed in him sufficiently to work with him. All that morning until past midday, at his digging, we had a garden barrel and shot the earth we removed against the kitchen range. We refreshed ourselves with a tin of mock turtle soup and wine from the neighboring pantry. I found a curious relief from the aching strangeness of the world in this steady labor. As we worked, I turned his project over in my mind, and presently objections and doubts began to arise, but I worked there all the morning. So glad was I to find myself with a purpose again. After working an hour, I began to speculate on the distance one had to go before the cloaca was reached, the chances we had of missing it altogether. My immediate trouble was why we should dig this long tunnel. when it was possible to get into the drain at one stone one of the manholes and work back to the house, it seemed to me too that the house was inconveniently chosen and required a needless length of tunnel. And just as I was beginning to face these things, the artilleryman stopped digging and looked at me. "We're working well," he said. He put down his speed that does knock off a bit. He said, "I think it's time. We recognize it from the roof of the house." I was for going on, and after a little hesitation, he resumed his spade, and then suddenly I was struck by a thought. I stopped, and so did he at once. "Why were you walking about the common?" I said, "Instead of being here, taking the air," he said. "I was coming back. It's safer by night." "But the work, oh, one can always work," he said. And in a flash I saw the man playing. He hesitated, holding his spade. "We ought to recognize it now," he said, "because if any come near, they may hear the spades and drop upon us unawares." I was no longer disposed to object. We went together to the roof and stood on a ladder. Peeping out of the roof door, no Martians were to be seen. And we ventured out on the tiles and slipped down under shelter of the parapet. From this position, a shrubbery hid the greater portion of Putney, but we could see the river below, a bubbly mass of red weed, and the low parts of Lambeth flooded and red. The red creepers swarmed up the trees about the old palace, and their branches stretched gaunt and dead, and set with shriveled leaves from amid its clusters. It was strange how entirely dependent both these things were upon flowing water for their propagation. About us neither had gained a footing. The Baronum's pink maize, snowballs and trees of arborvitae rose out of laurels and hydrangeas, green and brilliant into the sunlight. Beyond Kensington dead smoke was rising, and that and a blue haze head to the northward hills. The artilleryman began to tell me of the sort of people who still remained. In London one night last week, he said, some fools got the electric light in order, and there was all Regent Street in the circus ablaze, crowded with painted and ragged drunkards, men and women dancing and shouting till dawn. A man who was there told me, and as the day came, they became aware of a fighting machine standing nearby the Langham and looking down at them. Heaven knows how long he had been there. He must have given some of them a nasty turn. He came down the road towards them and picked up nearly 100, too drunk or frightened to run away. Grotesque gleam of a time no history will ever fully describe. From that, in answer to my questions, he came round to his grandiose plans again. He grew enthusiastic. He talked so eloquently of the possibility of capturing a fighting machine that I more than half believed in him again. But now that I was beginning to understand something of his quality, I could divine the stress he laid on doing nothing precipitately, and I noted that now there was no question that he personally was to capture and fight the great machine. After a time, we went down to the cellar. Neither of us seemed disposed to resume digging, and when he suggested a meal I was nothing low of, he became suddenly very generous, and when we had eaten, he went away and returned with some excellent cigars. We lit these, and his optimism glowed. He was inclined to regard my coming as a great occasion. "There's some champagne in the cellar," he said. "We can dig better on this tame side." "Burgundy," said I, "no city. I am host today. Champagne. Great God, with a heavy enough task before us, let us take a rest and gather strength while we may look at these blessed hands." And pursuant to his idea of a holiday, he insisted upon playing cards. After we had eaten, he taught me yucca, and after dividing London between us, I taking the northern side and he the southern, we played for parish points. Grotesque and foolish as this will seem, to the Suba reader it is absolutely true, and what is more remarkable, I found the card game and several others we played extremely interesting. Strange mind of man. that with our species upon the edge of extermination, or appalling degradation, with no clear prospect before us, but the chance of a horrible death, we could sit, following the chance of this painted pasteboard, and playing the joker with vivid delight. Afterwards he taught me poker, and I beat him at 3 tough chess games. When dark came, we decided to take the risk and lit a lamp. After an interminable string of games, we sucked, and the artilleryman finished the champagne. We went on smoking the cigars. He was no longer the energetic regenerator of his species I had encountered in the morning. He was still optimistic, but it was a less kinetic, a more thoughtful optimism. I remember he wound up with my health, proposed in a speech of small variety and considerable intermittence. I took a cigar and went upstairs to look at the lights, of which he had spoken, that blazed so greenly along the Highgate Hills. At first, I stared unintelligently across the London Valley. The northern hills were shrouded in darkness. The fires near Kensington glowed redly, and now and then an orange, red tongue of flame flashed up and vanished. In the deep blue night, all the rest of London was black. Then nearer I perceived a strange light, a pale violet-purple fluorescent glow, quivering under the night breeze for a space. I could not understand it, and then I knew that it must be the red weed, from which this faint irradiation proceeded. With that realization, my dormant sense of wonder, my sense of the proportion of things, awoke again. I glanced from that to Mars, red and clear glowing high in the west, and then gazed, long and earnestly, at the darkness of Hampstead and Highgate. I remained a very long time up on the roof, wondering the grotesque changes of the day. I recalled my mental states. From the midnight prayer to the foolish card playing, I had a violent revulsion of feeling. I remember I flung away the cigar with a certain wistful symbolism. My folly came to me with glaring exaggeration. I seemed a traitor to my wife, and to my kind I was filled with remorse. I resolved to leave this strange, undisciplined dreamer of great things to his drink and gluttony, and to go into London. There, it seemed to me, I had the best chance of learning what the Martians and my fellow men were doing. I was still upon the roof when the late moon rose. Chapter 8. Dead London. After I had parted from the artilleryman, I went down the hill and by the High Street, across the bridge to Fulham. The redweed was tumultuous at that time, and nearly choked the bridge roadway, but its fronds were already whitened in patches by the spreading disease that presently removed it so swiftly. At the corner of the lane that runs to Putney Bridge Station, I found a man lying. He was as black as a sweep with a black dust, alive but helplessly and speechlessly drunk. I could get nothing from him but curses and furious lunges at my head. I think I should have stayed by him, but for the brutal expression of his face. There was black dust along the roadway from the bridge onwards, and it grew thicker. In Fulham the streets were horribly quiet. I got food sour, hard and moldy, but quite eatable in a baker shop here. Some way towards Walham Green, the streets became clear of powder, and I passed a white terrace of hoses on fire. The noise of the burning was an absolute relief. Going on towards Brompton, the streets were quiet again. Kira came once more. Upon the black powder in the streets, and upon dead bodies I saw altogether about a dozen in the length of the film road. They had been dead many days, so that I hurried quickly past them. The black powder covered them over and softened their outlines. One or two had been disturbed by dogs where there was no black powder. It was curiously like a Sunday in the city, with the closed shops, the houses locked up and the blinds drawn. The desertion and the stillness. In some places plunderers had been at work, but rarely at other than the provision and wine shops. A jeweler's window had been broken open in one place, but apparently the thief had been disturbed, and a number of gold chains, and a watch lay scattered on the pavement. I did not trouble to touch them. Farther on was a tattered woman in a heap on a doorstep. The hand that hung over her knee was gashed and bled down her rusty brown dress, and a smashed magnum of champagne formed a pool across the pavement. She seemed asleep, but she was dead. The farther I penetrated into London, the profounder grew the stillness. But it was not so much the stillness of death. It was the stillness of suspense, of expectation at any time. The destruction that had already singed the Northwest. On borders of the metropolis, and had annihilated Ealing. And Kilburn might strike among these houses and leave them smoking ruins. It was a city condemned and derelict in South Kensington. The streets were clear of dead and of black powder. It was near South Kensington that I first heard the howling. It crept almost imperceptibly upon my senses. It was a sobbing alternation of two notes, Ola, 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 keeping on perpetually when I passed streets that ran northward. It grew in volume, and houses and buildings seemed to deaden. And cut it off again, it came in a full tide. Down Exhibition Road I stopped, staring towards Kensington Gardens, wondering at the strange remote wheeling. It was as if that mighty desert of houses had found a voice. For its fear and solitude, Ola, 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 Ola wheeled that superhuman note. Great waves of sound sweeping down the broad Sunnet Broadway between the tall buildings on each side. I turned northwards, marveling towards the iron gates of Hyde Park. I had half a mind to break into the National History Museum and find my way up to the summits of the towers in order to see across the park, but I decided to keep to the ground, where quick hiding was possible, and so went on up the Exhibition Road. All the large mansions on each side of the road were empty and still, and my footsteps echoed against the sides of the houses. At the top near the park gate, I came upon a strange sight. A bus overturned and a skeleton of a horse picked clean. I puzzled over this for a time, and then went on to the bridge over the Serpentine. The voice grew stronger and stronger, though I could see nothing above. The housetops on the north side of the park, see the haze of smoke to the northwest. Ola, 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 cried the voice, coming as it seemed to me from the district of Boat Regent's Park. The desolating cry worked upon my mind. The mood that had sustained me past the wheeling took possession of me. I found out was intensely weary, footsore, and now again hungry and thirsty. It was already past noon. Why was I wandering alone in the city of the dead? Why was I alone when all London was lying in state and in its black shroud? I felt intolerably lonely. My mind ran on old friends that I'd forgotten for years. I thought of the poisons in the chemist's shops, of the liquors the wine merchants stored. I recalled the two sudden creatures of despair who, so far as I knew, shared the city with myself. I came into Oxford Street by the Marble Arch, and here again were black powder and several bodies, and an evil, ominous smell from the greetings of the sailors. Of some of the houses, I grew very thirsty after the heat of my long walk. With infinite trouble, I managed to break into a public house and get food and drink. I was weary after eating and went into the parlour behind the bar and slept on a black horsehair sofa I found there. I walked to find that dismal howling still in my ears. O-L-A, O-L-A, O-Ola, Ola. It was no dusk, and after I had roted out some biscuits and a cheese. In the bar there was a meat safe, but it contained nothing but maggots. I wandered on through the silent residential squares to Baker Street. Portman Square is the only one I can name, and so came out at last upon Regent's Park. And as I emerged from the top of Baker Street, I saw far away over the trees, in the clearness of the sunset, the hood of the giant Martian, from which this howling proceeded. I was not terrified. I came upon him as if it were a matter of course. I watched him for some time, but he did not move. He appeared to be standing and yelling, for no reason that I could discover. I tried to formulate a plan of action. That perpetual sound of "ooh-la, confused my mind. Perhaps I was too tired to be very fearful. Certainly, I was more curious to know the reason of this monotonous crying than afraid. I turned back away from the park and struck into Park Road, intending to skirt the park. Went along under the shelter of the terraces and got a view of the stationary, howling Martian from the direction of St. John's Wood, a couple of 100 yards out of Baker Street. I heard a yelping chorus and saw, first, a dog with a piece of putrescent red meat in his jaws, coming headlong towards me. And then a pack of starving mongrels in pursuit of him. He made a wide curve to avoid me, as though he feared I might prove a fresh competitor. As the yelping died away down the silent road, the wailing sound of "Ola, Ola, Ola, Ola" reasserted itself. I came upon the wrecked handling machine, halfway to St. John's Wood Station. At first I thought a house had fallen across the road. It was only as I clambered among the ruins that I saw. With a start, this mechanical Samson, lying with its tentacles bent and smashed and twisted. Among the ruins it had made, the forepart was shattered. It seemed as if it had driven blindly, straight at the house, and had been overwhelmed at its overthrow. It seemed to me then that this might have happened by a handling machine. Escaping from the guidance of its Martian, I could not clamber among the ruins to see it. And the twilight was now so far advanced that the blood with which its seat was smeared, and the gnawed gristle of the Martian that the dogs had left were invisible to me. Wondering still more at all that I had seen, I pushed on towards Primrose Hill, far away through a gap in the trees. I saw a second Martian as motionless as the first, standing in the park, towards the zoological gardens and silent, a little beyond the ruins. About the smashed handling machine, I came upon the redweed again, and found the Regent's Canal, a spongy mass of dark red vegetation. As I crossed the bridge, the sound of "ooh-la, ooh-la, ooh-la, ooh-la" ceased. It was as it were, cut off. The silence came like a thunderclap. The dusky houses about me stood faint and tall and dim. The trees towards the park were growing black. All about me the redweed clambered among the ruins, writhing to get above me in the dimness night. The mother of fear and mystery was coming upon me. But while that voice sounded, the solitude, the desolation had been endurable by virtue of it. London had still seemed alive, and the sense of life about me had upheld me. Then suddenly a change, the passing of something and you not ward, and then a stillness that could be felt. Nothing but this gaunt quiet. London about me gazed at me spectrally. The windows in the White Houses were like the eye sockets of skulls. About me, my imagination found 1,000 noiseless enemies. Moving terror seized me, a horror of my temerity in front of me. The road became pitchy black as though it was tarred. I saw a contorted sheep lying across the pathway. I could not bring myself to go on. I turned down St. John's Wood Road and ran headlong from this uninjurable stillness. Towards Kilburn I hid from the night and the silence until long after midnight, in a cabin shelter in Harrow Road. But before the dawn my courage returned, and while the stars were still in the sky, I turned once more towards Regent's Park. I missed my way among the street, and presently saw down a long avenue, in the half-light of the early dawn, the curve of Primrose Hill. On the summit, towering up to the feeding stars, was a third Martian. Erect and motionless like the others, an insane resolve possessed me. I would die and end it, and it would save myself. Even the trouble of killing myself. I marched on recklessly towards this Titan. And then as I drew nearer, and the light grew, I saw that a multitude of black birds was circling and clustering about the hood. At that, my heart gave a bone, and I began running along the road. I hurried through the red weed that choked, and Edmund's Terrace I weeded breast-high across a torrent of water that was rushing down from the waterworks towards the Albert Road and emerged upon the grass before the rising of the sun. Great moans had been heaped about the crest of the hill, making a huge redoubt of it. It was the final and largest place the Martians had made, and from behind these heaps, there rose a thin smoke against the sky. Against the skyline, an eager dog ran and disappeared. The thought that flashed into my mind grew real, grew credible. I felt no fear, only a wild, trembling exultation. As I ran up the hill towards the motionless monster, out of the hood hung lank shreds of brown, at which the hungry birds pecked and tore. In another moment, I had scrambled up the earth and rampart and stood upon its crest, and the interior of the redout was below me. A mighty space at wars, with gigantic machines here and there within it, huge mounds of material and strange shelter places, and scattered about it, some in their overturned war machines, some in the no-rigid handling machines, and a dozen of them stark and silent, and laid in a row were the Martians dead, slain by the putrefactive and disease bacteria, against which their systems were unprepared, slain as the redweed was being slain, slain after all man's devices had failed, by the humblest things that God, in His wisdom, has put upon this earth, for so it had come about, as indeed I and many men might have foreseen, had not terror and disaster blinded our minds. These germs of disease have taken toll of humanity since the beginning of things, taken toll of our pre-human ancestor since life began here. But by virtue of this natural selection of our kind, we have developed resisting power to know. Germs do we succumb without a struggle, and too many, those that cause putrefaction in dead matter. For instance, our living frames are altogether immune, but there are no bacteria in Mars, and directly these invaders arrived, directly they drank and fed, our microscopic allies began to work their overthrow. Already when I watched them, they were irrevocably doomed, dying and rotting even as they went to and through. It was inevitable. By the toll of 1 billion deaths, man has bought his birthright of the earth, and it is his against all commerce. It would still be his, were the Martians 10 times as mighty as they are. For neither do men live nor die in vain. Here and there they were scattered, nearly 50 altogether in that great gulf they had made, overtaken by a death that must have seemed to them as incomprehensible as any death could be. To me also at that time this death was incomprehensible. All I knew was that these things that had been alive and so terrible to men were dead. For a moment I believe that the destruction of Sennacherib had been repeated, that God had repented, that the angel of death had slain them. In the night I stood staring into the pit, and my heart lightened gloriously, even as the rising sun struck the world to fire about me with his rays. The pit was still in darkness. The mighty engines, so great and wonderful in their power and complexity, so unearthly in their tortuous forms, rose weird and vague and strange, out of the shadows towards the light. A multitude of dogs I could hear fought over the bodies that lay darkly in the depth of the pit, far below me. Across the pit on its farther lip, flat and vast and strange, lay the great flying machine with which they had been experimenting upon our denser atmosphere when decay and death arrested them. Death had come not a day too soon. At the sound of a coin overhead, I looked up at the huge fighting machine that would fight no more, forever at the tattered, red shreds of flesh that dripped down upon the overturned seats. On the summit of Primrose Hill, I turned and looked down the slope of the hill to where, in halo to knowing birds, stood those other two Martians that I'd seen overnight. Just as death had overtaken them, the one had died, even as it had been crying to its companions. Perhaps it was the last to die, and its voice had gone on perpetually, until the force of its machinery was exhausted. The glitter no harmless tripod, towers of shining metal in the brightness of the sun, all about the pit, and saved as by a miracle from everlasting destruction. Stretched the great mother of cities, those who have only seen London, veiled in her somber robes of smoke, can scarcely imagine the naked clearness and beauty of the silent wilderness of houses, eastward over the black and ruins of the Albert Terrace, and the splintered spire of the church. The sun blazed dazzling in a clear sky, and here and there, some facet in the great wilderness of roofs caught the light and glared with a white intensity. Northward were Kilburn and Hampstead, blue and crowded with houses. Westward the great city was dimmed, and southward beyond the Martians, the green waves of Regent's Park, the Langham Hotel, the dome of the Albert Hall, the Imperial Institute, and the great mansions of the Brompton Road came out clear and little in the sunrise. The jagged ruins of Westminster rising easily beyond, far away and blue with the Surrey hills. And the towers of the Crystal Palace glittered like to silver rods. The dome of St. Paul's was dark against the sunrise, and injured I saw for the first time by a huge gaping cavity on its western side. And as I looked at this wide expanse of houses, and factories and churches, silent and abandoned, as I thought of the multitudinous hopes and efforts, the innumerable hosts of lives that had gone to build this human reef, and of the swift and ruthless destruction that had hung over it all, when I realized that the shadow had been rolled back, and that men might still live in the streets, and this dear vast, dead city of mine be once more alive and powerful, I felt a wave of emotion that was near akin to tears. The torment was over. Even that day the healing would begin. The survivors of the people scattered over the country, leaderless, lawless, foodless like sheep without a shepherd. The thousands who had fled by sea would begin to return. The pulse of life, growing stronger and stronger, would beat again in the empty streets and pour across the vacant squares. Whatever destruction was done, the hand of the destroyer was stayed. All the gaunt wrecks, the blackened skeletons of houses that stared so dismally at the sunlit grass of the hill, would presently be echoing with the hammers of the restorers and ringing with the tapping of their troubles. At the thought I extended my hands towards the sky and began thanking God. In a year, thought I, in a year. With overwhelming force came a thought of myself, of my wife, and the old life of hope and tender helpfulness that had ceased forever. Chapter 9, Wreckage. And now comes the strangest thing in my story, yet perhaps it is not altogether strange. I remember clearly and coldly and vividly all that I did that day until the time that I stood, weeping and praising God, upon the summit of Primrose Hill, and then I forget of the next 3 days. I know nothing. I have learned since that, so far from my being the first discoverer of the Martian overthrow, several such wanderers as myself had already discovered this on the previous night. One man, the first, had gone to St. Martin's La Grande, and while I sheltered in the cabin's hut, had contrived telegraph to Paris. Thence the joyful news had flashed all over the world. 1,000 cities, chilled by ghastly apprehensions, suddenly flashed into frantic illuminations. They knew of it in Dublin, Edinburgh, Manchester, Birmingham. At the time when I stood upon the verge of the pit, already men weeping with joy, as I have heard, shouting and stealing their work to shake hands and shout, or making up trains even as nearest crew to descend upon London. The church bells that had ceased a fortnight since suddenly caught the news, until all England was bell ringing. Man on cycles, lean-faced, unkempt, scorched along every country lane, shouting of unhoped deliverance, shouting to gaunt steering figures of despair, and for the food across the Channel, across the Irish Sea, across the Atlantic. Corn, bread, and meat were tearing to our relief. All the shipping in the world seemed going Londonward in those days, but of all this I have no memory. I drifted a demented man. I found myself in a house of kindly people, who had found me on the third day wandering, weeping, and raving through the streets of St. John's Wood. They have told me since that I was singing some insane doggerel about the last man left alive, hurrah. The last man left alive. Troubled as they were with their own affairs, these people whose name, much as I would like to express my gratitude to them, I may not even give here, nevertheless comfort themselves with me, sheltered me and protected me from myself. Apparently, they had learned something of my story from me. During the days of my lapse, very gently when my mind was assured again, that they break to me what they had learned. At the feet of Leatherhead, 2 days after I was imprisoned, it had been destroyed with every soul in it, by a Martian. He had swept it out of existence as it seemed, without any provocation as a boy might crush an anthill. In the mere wantedness of power, I was a lonely man, and they were very kind to me. I was a lonely man and a sad one, and they bore with me. I remained with them for days after my recovery. All that time I felt a growing craving to look once more on whatever remained of the little life that seemed so happy and bright. In my past, it was a mere hopeless desire to feast upon my misery. They dissuaded me, they did all they could to divert me from this morbidity. But at last I could resist the impulse no longer, and promising faithfully to return to them, and parting as I will confess from these for-day friends with tears, I went out again into the streets that had lately been so dark and strange and empty. Already they were busy with returning people in places. Even there were shops open, and I saw a drinking fountain running water. I remember how mockingly bright the day seemed as I went back on my melancholy pilgrimage to the little house at Walking. How busy the streets and vivid the moving life about me. So many people were abroad everywhere, busied in 1,000 activities, that it seemed incredible that any great proportion of the population could have been slain. But then I noticed how yellow were the skins of the people I met, how shaggy the hair of the men, how large and bright their eyes, and that every other man still wore his dirty rags. Their faces seemed all with one of two expressions: a leaping exaltation and energy, or a grim resolution, save for the expression of the faces. London seemed a city of tramps. The vestries were indiscriminately distributing bread, sent to us by the French government. The ribs of the few horses showed dismally haggard. Special constables with white badges stood at the corners of every street. I saw little of the mischief wrought by the Martians until I reached Wellington Street, and there I saw the redweed clam bring over the buttresses of Waterloo Bridge. At the corner of the bridge, too, I saw one of the common contrasts to that grotesque time: a sheet of paper flaunting against a thicket of the redweed, transfixed by a stick that kept it in place. It was the placard of the first newspaper to resume publication, the Daily Mail. I bought a copy for a blackened shilling I found in my pocket. Most of it was in blank, but the solitary compositor who did the thing had amused himself by making a grotesque scheme of advertisement. Stereo on the back page. The matter he printed was emotional. The news organization had not as yet found its way back. I learned nothing fresh except that already in 1 week, the examination of the Martian mechanisms had yielded astonishing results. Among other things, the article assured me, what I did not believe at the time, that the secret of flying was discovered. At Waterloo I found the free trains that were taking people to their homes. The first rush was already over. There were few people in the train, and I was in no mood for casual conversation. I got a compartment to myself and sat with folded arms, looking grayly at the sunlit devastation that flowed past the windows. And just outside the terminus, the train jolted over temporary rails, and on either side of the railway, the houses were black in ruins. To Clapham Junction, the face of London was grimy with powder. Of the black smoke, in spite of 2 days of thunderstorms and rain. And at Clapham Junction the line had been wrecked again. There were hundreds of out-of-work clerks and shortmen, working side by side with the customary navies, and we were jolted over. A hasty relaying all down the line from there. The aspect of the country was gone to unfamiliar. Wimbledon particularly had suffered, Walton by virtue of its unburned pine woods, seemed the least heart of any place along the line. The Wandle the Mole, every little stream was a heaped mass of redweed, an appearance between butcher's meat and pickled cabbage. The Surrey pine woods were to dry, however, for the festoons of the Red Climber, beyond Wimbledon within sight of the line, and certain nursery grounds with the heaped masses of earth. About the 6th cylinder, a number of people were standing about it, and some sappers were busy in the midst of it. Over it flaunted a Union Jack, flapping cheerfully in the morning breeze. The nursery grounds were everywhere, crimson with the weed, a wide expanse of livid color, cut with purple shadows and very painful to the eye. One's gaze went with infinite relief from the scorched grays and sullen reds of the foreground to the blue-green softness of the eastward hills. The line on the London side of Walking Station was still undergoing repair, so I descended at Byfleet Station and took the road to Maybury, past the place where I and the artilleryman had talked to the Hazers, and on by the Sport, where the Martian had appeared to me. In the thunderstorm, here moved by curiosity, I turned aside to find among a tangle of red fronds the warped and broken dog cart, with the whitened bones of the horse scattered and gnawed. For a time I stood regarding these vestiges. Then I returned through the pine wood, neck high with redweed here and there, to find the landlord of the Spotted Dog had already found burial, and so came home past the College Arms. A man standing at an open cottage door greeted me by name as I passed. I looked at my house with a quick flash of hope that faded immediately. The door had been forced, it was unfast and was opening slowly. As I approached, it slammed again. The curtains of my study fluttered out of the window, from which I and the artilleryman had watched the dawn. No one had closed it since. The smashed bushes were just as I had left them, nearly 4 weeks ago. I stumbled into the hall and the house felt empty. The stair carpet was ruffled and discolored. Where I had crouched, soaked to the skin from the thunderstorm, the night of the catastrophe, or muddy footsteps I saw still went up. The stairs, I followed them to my study, and found lying on my writing table, still with the selenite paper weight upon it, the sheet of work I had left in the afternoon of the opening of the cylinder. For a space I stood reading over my abandoned arguments. It was a paper on the probable development of moral ideas with the development of the civilizing process. And the last sentence was the opening of a prophecy. In about 200 years, I had written, we may expect. The sentence ended abruptly. I remember my inability to fix my mind that morning. Scarcely a month gone by, and how I had broken off to get my daily chronicle from the newsboy. I remembered how I went down to the garden gate as he came along, and how I had listened to his old story of men from Mars. I came down and went into the dining room. There were the mutton and the bread, both far gone now in decay, and a beer bottle overturned, just as I and the artilleryman had left them. My home was desolate. I perceived the folly of the faint hope I had cherished so long. And then a strange thing occurred. It is no use, said a voice. The house is deserted. No one has been here these 10 days. Do not stay here to torment yourself. No one escaped but you. I was startled. Had I spoken my thought aloud? I turned and the French window was open behind me. I made a step to it and stood looking out. And there, amazed and afraid, even as I stood amazed and afraid, were my cousin and my wife white and tearless. She gave a faint cry. I came, she said. I knew. She put her hand to our throat. Swayed, I made a step forward and caught her in my arms. Chapter 10, the epilogue. I cannot but regret know that I'm concluding my story. How little I am able to contribute to the discussion of the many debatable questions which are still unsettled. In one respect, I shall certainly provoke criticism. My particular province is speculative philosophy. My knowledge of comparative physiology is confined to a book or two. But it seems to me that Carver's suggestions as to the reason of the rapid death of the Martians is so probable as to be regarded almost as a proven conclusion. I have assumed that in the body of my narrative, at any rate, in all the bodies of the Martians that were examined after the war, no bacteria, except those already known as terrestrial species, were found that they did not bury any of their dead. And the reckless slaughter they perpetrated point also to an entire ignorance of the putrefactive process. But probable as this seems, is by no means a proven conclusion. Neither is the composition of the black smoke known, which the Martians used with such deadly effect, and the generator of the heat rays remains a puzzle. The terrible disasters at the Ealing and South Kensington laboratories have disinclined analysts for further investigations. Upon the latter, spectrum analysis of the black powder points unmistakably to the presence of an unknown element, with a brilliant group of 3 lines in the green, and it is possible that it combines with argon to form a compound which acts at once with deadly effect upon some constituent in the blood. But such unproven speculations will scarcely be of interest to the general reader, to whom this story is addressed. None of the brown scum that drifted down the Thames after the destruction of Shepperton was examined at the time, and now none is forthcoming. The results of an anatomical examination of the Martians, so far as the prowling dogs had left such an examination possible, I have already given. But everyone is familiar with the magnificent and almost complete specimen in spirits at the Natural History Museum, and the countless drawings that have been made from it. And beyond that, the interest of their physiology and structure is purely scientific. A question of graver and universal interest is the possibility of another attack from the Martians. I do not think that nearly enough attention is being given to this aspect of the matter. At present, the planet Mars is in conjunction, but with every return to opposition, I for one anticipate a renewal of their adventure in any case. We should be prepared. It seems to me that it should be possible to define the position of the gun from which the shots are discharged, to keep a sustained watch upon this part of the planet, and to anticipate the arrival of the next attack. In that case, the cylinder might be destroyed with dynamite or artillery before it was sufficiently cool for the Martians to emerge, or they might be butchered by means of guns so soon as the screw opened. It seems to me that they have lost a vast advantage in the failure of their first surprise. Possibly they see it in the same light. Lessing has advanced excellent reasons for supposing that the Martians have actually succeeded in effecting a landing on the planet Venus 7 months ago now. Venus and Mars were in alignment with the Sun. That is to say, Mars was in opposition. From the point of view of an observer on Venus, subsequently a peculiar, luminous and sinuous marking appeared on the unillumined half of the inner planet, and almost simultaneously, a faint dark mark of a similar, sinuous character was detected upon a photograph of the Martian disk. One needs to see the drawings of these appearances in order to appreciate fully their remarkable resemblance and character. At any rate, whether we expect another invasion or not, our views of the human future must be greatly modified by these events, We have learned now that we cannot regard this planet as being fenced in and a secure, abiding place for man. We can never anticipate the unseen, good or evil, that we come upon us suddenly out of space. It may be that in the larger design of the universe, this invasion from Mars is not without its ultimate benefit. From men it has robbed us of that serene confidence in the future, which is the most fruitful source of decadence. The gifts to human science it has brought are enormous, and it has done much to promote the conception of the commonweal of mankind. It may be that across the immensity of space, the Martians have watched the feet of these pioneers of theirs and learned their lesson, and that on the planet Venus, they have found a secure settlement. Be that as it may, for many years yet, there will certainly be no relaxation of the eager scrutiny of the Martian disk and those fiery darts of the sky. The shooting stars will bring with them as they fall an unavoidable apprehension to all the sons of men. The broadening of men's views that has resulted can scarcely be exaggerated. Before the cylinder fell, there was a general persuasion that through all the deep of space, no life existed beyond the petty surface of our minute sphere. Now we see further. If the Martians can reach Venus, there is no reason to suppose that the thing is impossible for men. And when the slow cooling of the sun makes this earth uninhabitable, as at last it must do, it may be that the thread of life that has begun here will have streamed out and caught our sister planet within its toils. Dim and wonderful is the vision I have conjured up in my mind of life spreading slowly from this little seed bed of the solar system throughout the inanimate vastness of sidereal space. But that is a remote dream. It may be, on the other hand, that the destruction of the Martians is only a reprieve. To them and not to us, perhaps as the future ordained. I must confess the stress and danger of the time have left an abiding sense of doubt and insecurity in my mind. I sit in my study writing my lamplight, and suddenly I see again the healing valley below, set with writhing flames, and feel the house behind and about me, empty and desolate. I go out into the Befleek road and vehicles pass me. A butcher boy in a cart, a cab full of visitors, a workman on a bicycle, children going to school. And suddenly they become vague and unreal, and I hurry again with the artillery man. Through the hot brooding silence, overnight, I see the black powder darkening the silent street, and the contorted body shrouded in that layer. They rise upon me tattered and dog-bitten. They gibber and grow fiercer, paler, uglier. Mad distortions of humanity at last, and I wake, cold and wretched in the darkness of the night. I go to London and see the busy multitudes in Fleet Street and the Strand, and it comes across my mind that they are but the ghosts of the past, haunting the streets that I have seen, silent and wretched, going to and fro phantasms in a dead city, the mockery of life in a galvanized body. And strange too, it is to stand on Primrose Hill, as I did but a day before writing this last chapter, to see the great province of houses, dim and blue through the haze of the smoke and mist, vanishing at last into the vague lower sky, to see the people walking to and fro among the flower beds on the hill, to see the sightseers about the Martian machine that stands there still, to hear the tumult of playing children, and to recall the time when I saw it all, bright and clear-cut, hard and silent under the dawn of that last great day. And strangest of all it is to hold my wife's hand again, and to think that I have counted her, and that she has counted me among the dead, the first man in the moon. Performed by Alexander Vlahos. Chapter 1. Mr. Bedford meets Mr. Cavill at Lim. As I sit down to write here, amidst the shadows of vine leaves, under the blue sky of southern Italy, it comes to me with a certain quality of astonishment that my participation in these amazing adventures of Mr. Cavill was, after all, the outcome of the purest accident it might have been. Anyone I fell into these things, At a time when I thought myself removed from the slightest possibility of disturbing experiences, I had gone to Lim because I had imagined it. The most uneventful place in the world. Here at any rate, said I shall find peace and a chance to work. And this book is the sequel, so utterly at variance is destiny, with all the little plans of men. I may perhaps mention here that very recently I'd come an ugly cropper in certain business enterprises, sitting now, surrounded by all the circumstances of wealth. There's a luxury in admitting my extremity. I can admit even that to a certain extent. My disasters were conceivably of my own making, it may be. There are directions in which I have some capacity, but the conduct of business operations is not among these. But in those days I was young, and my youth, among other objectionable forms, took that of a pride in my capacity for affairs. I am young still in years, but the things that have happened to me have rubbed something of the youth from my mind. Whether they have brought any wisdom to light below, it is a more doubtful matter. It is scarcely necessary to go into the details of the speculations that landed me a limb in Kent, nowadays even about business transactions. There's a strong spice of adventure. I took risks in these things. There's invariably a certain amount of give and take, and it fell to me finally to do the giving, reluctantly enough, even when I had to go out of everything one can. Tankerous creditors were fit to be malignant. Perhaps you have met that flaming sense of outrage, virtue, or perhaps you have only felt it. Here in me heart it seemed to me at last that there was nothing for it but to write a play, unless I wanted to drudge for my living as a clerk. I have a certain imagination and luxurious taste, and I meant to make a vigorous fight for it before that fate overtook me. In addition to my belief in powers as a businessman, I had always in those days had an idea that I was equal to writing a very good play. It is not, I believe, a very uncommon persuasion. I knew there is nothing a man can do outside legitimate business transactions that has such opulent possibilities. Very probably that biased my opinion. I had indeed got into the habit of regarding this unwritten drama as a convenient little reserve put by for a rainy day. That rainy day had come and I set to work. I soon discovered that writing a play was a longer business than I had supposed. At first I had reckoned 10 days for it, and it was to have appeared to tier while it was in hand that I came to Lim. I reckoned myself lucky in getting that little bungalow. I got it on a 3 years agreement. I put in a few sticks of furniture, and while the play was in hand, I did my own cooking. My cooking would have shocked Mrs. Bond, and yet, you know, it had flavor, had a coffee pot, a saucepan for eggs and one for potatoes, and a frying pan for sausages and bacon. Such was the simple apparatus of my comfort. One cannot always be magnificent, but simplicity is always a possible alternative. For the rest, I laid in an 18-gallon cask of beer on credit, and a trustful baker came each day. It was not perhaps in the style of Cyprus, but I have had worse times. I was a little sorry for. The baker was a very decent man indeed, but even for him I hoped, certainly if anyone wants solitude. The place is Lim. It is in the clay part of Kent, and my bungalow stood on the edge of an old sea cliff and set across the flats of Rumney Marsh of the sea. In very wet weather the place is almost inaccessible, and I have heard that at times the postman used to traverse the most succulent portions of this route with boards upon his feet. I never saw him doing so, but I can quite imagine it. Outside the doors of the few cottages and houses that make up the present village, big birch basins are stuck to wipe off the worst of the clay, which will give some idea of the texture of the district. I doubt if the place would be there at all if it were not fading memory of things gone forever. It was the big port of England in Roman times, Portus Lemanus, and now the sea is for miles away. All down the steep hill are boulders and masses of Roman brickwork. And from an old waddling street, still paved in places, starts like an arrow to the north. I used to stand on the hill and think of it all. The galleys and legions, the captives and officials, the women and traders, the speculators like myself, all the swarm and tumors that came clanking in and out of the harbor, and now just a few lumps of rubble on a grassy slope, and a sheep or two, and I in where the port had been, with the levels of the marsh sweeping round in a broad curve to distant Dungeonies, and dotted here and there with tree clumps and the church towers of old, medieval towns that are following Lemnis, now towards extinction. That outlook on the marsh was, indeed, one of the finest views I have ever seen. I suppose Dungeonies was 15 miles away. It lay like a raft on the sea, and farther westward with the hills by Hastings. Under the setting sun, sometimes they hung close and clear. Sometimes they were faded and low, and often the drift of the weather took them clean out of sight. And all the nearer parts of the marsh were laced and lit by ditches and canals. The window at which I worked looked over the skyline of this crest, and it was from this window that I first set eyes on Cavil. It was just as I was struggling with my scenario, holding down my mind at the sheer hard work of it, and naturally enough he arrested my attention. The sun had set. The sky was a vivid tranquility of green and yellow, and against that he came out black, the oddest little figure. He was a short, round-bodied, thin-legged little man with a jerky quality in his motions. He had seen fit to clothe his extraordinary mind in a cricket cap and overcoat, and cycling knickerbockers and stockings. Why he did so I do not know, for he never cycled and he never played cricket. It was a fortuitous concurrent of garments arising. I know not how. He gesticulated with his hands and arms, and jerked his head about and buzzed. He buzzed like something electric. You never heard such buzzing, and ever and again. He cleared his throat with a most extraordinary noise. There had been rain, and that spasmodic walk of his was enhanced by the extreme slipperiness of that footpath, exactly as he came against the sun. He stopped, pulled out a watch, hesitated, then with a sort of convulsive gesture, he turned and retreated with every manifestation of haste, no longer gesticulating, but going with ample strides that showed the relatively large size of his feet. They were, I remember, grotesquely exaggerated in size by adhesive clay. To the best possible advantage, this occurred on the first day of my season, when my playwriting energy was at its height, and I regarded the incident simply as an annoying distraction, the waste of 5 minutes. I returned to my scenario, but when next evening, the apparition was repeated with remarkable precision, and again the next evening, and indeed every evening when rain was not falling, concentration upon the scenario became a considerable effort, and found the man, I said, one would think he was learning to be a marionette. And for several evenings I cursed him pretty heartily. Then my annoyance gave way to amazement and curiosity. Why on earth should a man do this thing? On the 14th evening I could stand it no longer, and so soon as he appeared, I opened the French window, crossed the veranda, and directed myself to the point where he invariably stopped. He had his watch out as I came up to him. He had a chubby rubicund face with reddish-brown eyes. Previously I had seen him only against the light. "One moment, sir," said I as he turned. He stared. "1 moment," he said. "Most certainly, or if you wish to speak to me for longer, as it is not asking too much. Your moment is up. Would it trouble you to accompany me?" Not in the least should I, placing myself beside him. "My habits are regular, my time for intercourse limited. This, I presume, is your time for exercise." "It is. I come here to enjoy the sunset." "You don't, sir. You never look at it. Never look at it, no. I've watched you 30 nights. But not once have you looked at the sunset. Not once." He knitted his brows like one who encounters a problem. Well, I enjoy the sunlight, the atmosphere. I go along this path through that gate." He jerked his head over his shoulder and around. You never have been. It's all nonsense, there is no way." "Tonight, for instance." "Oh, tonight. Let me see." I just glanced at my watch. Saw that I'd already been out just 3 minutes. Over the precise half hour. Decided there was not time to go around turned. "You always do." He looked at me, reflected. "Perhaps I do now I come to think of it. But what was it you wanted to speak to me about?" "Why this. Yes. Why do you do it every night you come making a noise?" Making a noise like this, I imitated his buzzing noise. He looked at me, and it was evident the buzzing awakened distaste. "Do I do that?" he asked. "Every blessed evening?" "Oh, I had no idea." He stopped dead. He regarded me gravely. "Can it be," he said, "that I have formed a habit?" "Well, it looks like it, doesn't it?" He pulled down his lower lip between finger and thumb. He regarded a puddle at his feet. "My mind is much occupied," he said. "And you want to know why? Well, sir, I can assure you that. Not only do I not know why I do these things, but I did not even know I did them. Come to think, it is just as you say. I never have been beyond that field, and these things annoy you." For some reason, I was beginning to relent towards him. "Not annoy," I said, "but imagine yourself writing a play." I couldn't. "Well, anything that needs concentration," he said, "of course," and meditated. His expression became so eloquent of distress that I relented still more. After all, there's a touch of aggression in demanding of a man. You don't know why he hums on a public footpath. "You see," he said weakly, "it's a habit." "Oh, I recognize that. I must stop it. But not if it puts you out. After all, I had no business. It's something of a liberty." No, not at all, sir," he said, "not at all. I am greatly indebted to you. I should guard myself against these things in future." "I will. Could I trouble you once again? That noise, something like this," I said. "But really, I'm greatly obliged to you. In fact, I know I'm getting absurdly absent-minded." "You are quite justified, sir. Perfectly justified indeed. I am in debt to you, the thing shall end. And now, sir, I have already brought you farther than I should have done. I do hope my impertinence who—" "Not at all, sir. Not at all." We regarded each other for a moment. I raised my hat and wished him a good evening. He responded convulsively, and so we went our ways. At the stile, I looked back at his receding figure. His bearing had changed remarkably. He seemed limp, shrunken, the contrast with his former, gesticulating as a zooing self, took me in some absurd way, as pathetic. I watched him out of sight. Then, wishing very heartily I had kept to my own business, I returned to my bungalow and my play. The next evening I saw nothing of him, nor the next, but he was very much in my mind, and it had occurred to me that as a sentimental, comic character he might serve a useful purpose. In the development of my plot, the third day he called upon me. For a time I was puzzled to think what had brought him. He made indifferent conversation in the most formal way. Then abruptly, he came to business. He wanted to buy me out of my bungalow. "You see," he said, "I don't blame you in the least, but you've destroyed a habit and it disorganizes my day. I've walked past here for years, no doubt I've hummed well. You've made all that impossible." I suggested he might try some other direction. "No, there is no other direction. This is the only one. I've been quiet. And now every afternoon at 4, I come to a dead wall. But my dear sir, if the thing is so important to you, it's vital. You see, I'm an investigator. I am engaged in scientific research. I live." He paused and seemed to think. "Just over there," he said, and pointed suddenly dangerously near my eye. "The house with white chimneys. You see dust over the trees. And my circumstances are abnormal. I am on the point of completing one of the most important demonstrations. I can assure you, one of the most important demonstrations that have ever been made. It requires constant thought, constant mental ease and activity, and the afternoon was my brightest time ever, vesting with new ideas, new points of view. But why not come by still? It would be all different. I should be self-conscious. I should think of you at your play. Watching me irritated instead of thinking of my work. No, I must have the bungalow. They meditated naturally. I wanted to think the matter over thoroughly. Before anything decisive was said, I was generally ready enough for business in those days, and selling always attracted me. But in the first place, it was not my bungalow. And even if I sold it to him at a good price, I might get inconvenience in the delivery of goods. If the current owner got wind of the transaction, and in the second I was well undischarged, it was clearly a business that required delicate handling. Moreover, the possibility of his being in pursuit of some valuable invention also interested me. It occurred to me that I would like to know more of this research, not with any dishonest intention, but simply with an idea that to know what it was would be a relief from playwriting. I threw out fearless. He was quite willing to supply information. Indeed, once he was fairly underway, the conversation became a monologue. He talked like a man long pent up, who has had it over with himself. Again and again, he talked for nearly an hour, and I must confess, I found it a pretty stiff bit of listening. But through it all, there was the undertone of satisfaction one feels when one is neglecting work. One has set oneself during that first interview. I gathered very little of the drift of his work. Half his words were technicalities, entirely strange to me, and he illustrated one or two points with what he was pleased to call elementary mathematics, computing on an envelope with a copying ink pencil in a manner that made it hard even to seem to understand. Yes, I said yes, go on. Nevertheless, I made out enough to convince me that he was no mere crank, playing at discoveries. In spite of his crank-like appearance, there was a force about him that made that impossible. Whatever it was a thing with mechanical possibilities. He told me of a workshop he had and of 3 assistants, originally job and carpenters whom he had trained. Now from the workshop to the patent office is clearly only one step. He invited me to see those things. I accepted readily and took care by remark or so to underline that the proposed transfer of the bungalow remained very conveniently in suspense. At last he rose to depart, with an apology for the length of his call. Talking over his work was, he said, a pleasure enjoyed only too rarely. It was not often he found such an intelligent listener as myself. He mingled very little with professional scientific men. So much pettiness explained, so much intrigue, and really, when one has an idea, a novel, fertilizing idea. I don't want to be uncharitable, but I am a man who believes in impulses. I made what was perhaps a rash proposition, but you must remember that I had been alone, playwriting in limb for 14 days, and my compunction for his ruined walk still hung about me. Why not should I make this your new habit in the place of the one I spoiled? At least until we can settle about the bungalow. What you want is to turn over your work in your mind that you have always done during your afternoon walk. Unfortunately, that's over. You can't get things back as they were. But why not come and talk about your work to me? Use me as a sort of war against which you may throw your thoughts and catch them again. It's certain I don't know enough to steal your ideas myself. And I know no scientific man. I stopped. He was considering. Evidently the thing attracted him, but I'm afraid I should bore you. He said, you think I'm too dull? Oh no, but technicalities. Anyhow, you've interested me immensely this afternoon. Of course it would be a great help to me. Nothing clears up one's idea so much as explaining them. You hear the two, my dear sir. Say no more, but really, can you spare the time? There's no rest like change of occupation, I said with profound conviction. The affair was over on my veranda steps. He turned. I am already greatly indebted to you. He said. I made an interrogative noise. You have completely cured me of that ridiculous habit of humming. He explained, I think. I said I was glad to be of any service to him. And he turned away immediately, the train of thought that our conversation had suggested must have resumed its way. His arms began to wave in their former fashion. The faint echo of Zoo came back to me on the breeze. Well, after all, that was not my affair. He came the next day, and again the next day after that, and delivered 2 lectures on physics, to our mutual satisfaction. He talked with an air of being extremely lucid about the ether and tubes of force, and gravitational potential and things like that. And I sat in my other folding chair and said, yes. Go on, I follow you to keep him going. It was tremendously difficult stuff. But I do not think he ever suspected how much I did not understand him. There were moments when I doubted whether I was well employed, but at any rate, I was resting from that confounded play. Now and then things gleamed on me clearly for a space, only to vanish just when I thought I had hold of them. Sometimes my attention failed altogether, and I would give it up and sit and stare at him, wondering whether, after all, it would not be better to use him as a central figure in a good farce and let all this other stuff slide. And then perhaps I would catch on again for a bit. At the earliest opportunity, I went to see his house. It was large and carelessly furnished. There were no servants other than history assistants. And his dietary and private life were characterized by a philosophical simplicity. He was a water drinker, a vegetarian, and all those logical disciplinary things. But the sight of his equipment settled many doubts. It looked like business from cellar to attic, an amazing little place to find, in an out-of-the-way village. The ground floor rooms contained benches and apparatus, the bakehouse and scullery. Boiler had developed into respectable furnaces. Dynamos occupied the cellar, and there was a gasometer in the garden. He showed it to me, with all the confiding zest of a man who has been living too much alone. His seclusion was overflowing, now in an excess of confidence, and I had the good luck to be the recipient. The 3 assistants were credible specimens of the class of handymen from which they came, conscientious if unintelligent, strong, civil, and willing. One Spargus, who did the cooking and all the metal work, had been a sailor. The second, Gibbs, was a joiner, and the third was an ex-job and gardener, and now general assistant. They were the nearest laborers. All the intelligent work was done by cavil. Theirs was the darkest ignorance, compared even with my mottled impression then. Now as to the nature of these inquiries, here unhappily comes a grave difficulty. I am no scientific expert, and if I were to attempt to set forth, in the highly scientific language of Mr. Cavil, the aim to which his experiments tended, I am afraid I should confuse not only the reader, but myself, and almost certainly I should make some blunder that would bring upon me the mockery of every up-to-date student of mathematical physics in the country. The best thing I can do, therefore, is, I think, to give my impressions in my own inexact language, without any attempt to wear a garment of knowledge, to which I have no claim. The object of Mr. Cavill's search was a substance that should be opaque. He used some other word I have forgotten, but opaque conveys the idea to all forms of radiant energy. Radiant energy, he made me understand, was anything like light or heat, or those Ranchin rays there was so much talk about a year or so ago, or the electric waves of Marconi or gravitation. All these things, he said, radiate out from centers and act on bodies at a distance, whence comes the term radiant energy. Now almost all substances are opaque to some form or other of radiant energy. Glass, for example, is transparent to light, but much less so to heat, so that it is useful as a fire screen. And alum is transparent to light, but blocks heat completely. A solution of iodine in carbon bisulfide, on the other hand, completely blocks light, but it is quite transparent to heat. It will hide a fire from you, but permit all its warmth to reach you. Metals are not only opaque to light and heat, but also to electrical energy, which passes through both iodine solutions and glass, almost as though they were not interposed, and so on. Now all known substances are transparent to gravitation. You can use screens of various sorts to cut off the light, or heat or electrical influence of the sun, or the warmth of the earth from anything. You can screen things by sheets of metal from Marconi's rays, but nothing will cut off the gravitational attraction of the sun or the gravitational attraction of the earth. Yet why there should be nothing is hard to say. Cavell did not see why such a substance should not exist, and certainly I could not tell him. I'd never thought of such a possibility before. He showed me by calculations on paper, which Lord Kelvin, no doubt, or Professor Lodge or Professor Carl Pearson, or any of those great scientific people might have understood, but which simply reduced me to a hopeless model, that not only was such a substance possible, but that it must satisfy certain conditions. It was an amazing piece of reasoning, much as it amazed and exercised me at the time. It would be impossible to reproduce it here. Yes, I said to all, yes, go on, suffice it for this story, that he believed he might be able to manufacture this possible substance opaque to gravitation out of a complicated alloy of metals and something new. A new element I fancy called, I believe, helium, which was sent to him from London in sealed stone jars. Doubt has been thrown upon this detail, but I am almost certain it was helium. He had sent him in sealed stone jars. It was certainly something very gaseous and thin. If only I had taken notes, but then, how was I to foresee the necessity of taking notes? Anyone with the nearest germ of an imagination will understand the extraordinary possibilities of such a substance, and will sympathize a little with the emotion I felt as this understanding emerged from the haze of abstruse phrases in which Cavell expressed himself. Comic relief in a play indeed. It was some time before I would believe that I had interpreted him aright, and I was very careful not to ask questions that would have enabled him to gauge the profundity of misunderstanding into which he dropped his daily exposition. But no one reading this story of it here will sympathize fully, because from my barren narrative, it will be impossible to gather the strength of my conviction that this astonishing substance was positively going to be made. I do not recall that I gave my plan hours consecutive work. At any time after my visit to his house, my imagination had other things to do. There seemed no limit to the possibilities of the stuff. Whichever way I tried, I came on miracles and revolutions. For example, if one wanted to lift a weight, however enormous, one had only to get a sheet of this substance beneath it, and one might lift it with a straw. My first natural impulse was to apply this principle to guns and ironclads and all the material and methods of war, and from that to shipping, locomotion, building every conceivable form of human industry. The chance that had brought me into the very birth chamber of this new time, it was an epic no less, was one of those chances that come once in 1,000 years. The thing unrolled, it expanded and expanded. Among other things, I saw in it my redemption as a businessman. I saw a parent company and daughter companies, applications to right of U.S., applications to left rings and trusts, privileges and concessions, spreading and spreading until one vast, stupendous cavalry company ran and ruled the world. And I was in it. I took my line straight away. I knew I was staking everything, but I jumped there, and then we on. Absolutely, the biggest thing that has ever been invented. I said and put the accent on we. If you want to keep me out of this, you have to do it with a gun. I'm coming down to be your fourth labor tomorrow. He seemed surprised at my enthusiasm, but not a bit suspicious or hostile. Rather, he was self-depreciatory. He looked at me doubtfully. But do you really think, he said, and you play? How about that play? It's vanished, I cried. My dear sir, don't you see what you've got? Don't you see what you're going to do? That was merely a rhetorical turn, but positively he didn't. At first I could not believe it. He had not had the beginning of the inkling of an idea. This astonishing little man had been working on purely theoretical grounds. The whole time, when he said, it was the most important research the world had ever seen, he simply meant it squared up so many theories, settled so much that was in doubt. He had troubled. No more about the application of the stuff he was going to turn out. That if he had been a machine that makes guns, this was a possible substance, and he was going to make it vlatute, as the Frenchman says. Beyond that, he was childish. If he made it, it would go down to posterity as cavalry or cavallini, and he would be made an FRS, and his portrait given away as a scientific worthy, with nature and things like that, and that was all he saw. He would have dropped this bombshell into the world, as though he had discovered a new species of gnat. If it had not happened that I had come along and there, it would have lain and fizzled like one or two other little things. These scientific people have lit and dropped about us. When I realized this, it was I did the talking and Cavil who said go on. I jumped up. I paced the room gesticulating like a boy of 20. I tried to make him understand his duties and responsibilities in the matter. Our duties and responsibilities in the matter. I assured him we might make wealth, enough to work. Any sort of social revolution we fancied. We might own and order the whole world. I told him of companies and patterns, and the case of secret processes. All these things seemed to take him, much as his mathematics had taken me. A look of perplexity came into his ruddy little face. He stammered something about indifference to wealth, but I brushed all that aside. He had got to be rich, and it was no good his stammering. I gave him to understand the sort of man I was, and that I had very considerable business experience. I did not tell him I was an undischarged bankrupt at the time, because that was temporary, but I think I reconciled my evident poverty with my financial claims, and quite insensibly, in the way such projects grow, the understanding of a cavalry monopoly grew up between us. He was to make the stuff, and I was to make the boom. I stuck like a leech to the we. You and I didn't exist for me. His idea was that the profits I spoke of might go to endow research, but that, of course, was a matter we had to settle later. Well, that's all right. I shouted, that's all right. The great point, as I insisted, was to get the thing done. Here's a substance, I cried. No home, no factory. No fortress, no ship can dare to be without. More universally applicable, even than a patent medicine. There isn't a solitary aspect of it, not one of its 10,000 possible uses, that will not make us rich. Cavil beyond the dreams of avarice, no, he said. I begin to see, it's extraordinary, how one gets new points of view by talking over things. And as it happens, you have just talked to the right man. I suppose no one, he said, is absolutely averse to enormous wealth. Of course there is one thing. He paused. I stood still. It is just possible, you know, that we may not be able to make it after all. It may be one of those things that are a theoretical possibility, but a practical absurdity. When we make it, there may be some little hitch. We'll tackle the hitch when it comes, said I. Chapter 2, the first making of Catharite. But Caval's fears were groundless, so far as the actual making was concerned. On October 14, 1899, this incredible substance was made. Oddly enough, it was made at last by accident, when Mr. Cavall least expected it. He had fused together a number of metals and certain other things. I wish I knew the particulars now, and he intended to leave the mixture a week, and then allow it to cool slowly, unless he had miscalculated. The last stage in the combination would occur when the stuff sank to a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But it chanced that, unknown to Cavall, dissension had arisen about the furnace tending. Gibbs, who had previously seen to this, had suddenly attempted to shift it to the man who had been a gardener on the school that coal was soil being dug, and therefore could not possibly fall within the province of a joiner. The man who had been a job and gardener alleged, however, that coal was a metallic or like substance, let alone that he was cook. But Spargus insisted on Gibbs doing the coaling, seeing that he was a joiner, and that coal is notoriously fossil wood. Consequently, Gibbs ceased to replenish the furnace, and no one else did so, and Cavall was too much immersed in certain interesting problems concerning a covert flying machine, neglecting the resistance of the air, and one or two other points, to perceive that anything was wrong, and the premature birth of his invention took place just as he was coming across the field to my bungalow for our afternoon talk and tea. I remember the occasion with extreme vividness. The water was boiling and everything was prepared, and the sound of his zoo had brought me out. Upon the veranda his active little figure was black against the autumnal sunset, and to the right the chimneys of his house just rose above the gloriously tinted group of trees. Remote arose the Wealden hills, faint and blue, while to the left the hazy marsh spread out, spacious and serene. And then the chimneys jerked heavenward, smashing into a string of bricks as they rose, and the roof and a miscellany of furniture followed. Then overtaking them came a huge white flame. The trees about the building swayed and whirled, and tore themselves to pieces that sprang towards the flare. My ears were smitten with a clap of thunder that left me deaf on one side. For life and all about me, windows smashed unheeded. I took 3 steps from the veranda towards Cavall's house, and even as I did so came the wind. Instantly my coattails were over my head, and I was progressing in great leaps and bounds, and quite against my will towards him. In the same moment, the discoverer was seized, whirled about, and flew through the screaming air. I saw one of my chimney pots hit the ground. Within 6 yards of me leap a score of feet, and so hurry, and great strides towards the focus of the disturbance. Cavall, kicking and flapping, came down again, rolled over and over on the ground for a space, struggled up and was lifted, and borne forward at an enormous velocity, vanishing at last among the laboring, lashing trees that arrived about his house. A mass of smoke and ashes and a square of bluish, shining substance rushed up towards the zenith. A large fragment of fencing came sailing past me, dropped edgeways, hit the ground, and fell flat. And then the worst was over. The aerial commotion fell swiftly, until it was a mere strong gale, and I became once more aware that I had breath and feet. By leaning back against the wind, I managed to stop, and could collect such wits as still remained to me. In that instant the whole face of the world had changed. The tranquil sunset had vanished. The sky was dark with scurry and clouds. Everything was flattened and swaying with the gale. I glanced back to see if my bungalow was still, in a general way standing, then staggered forwards towards the trees, amongst which Cavall had vanished, and through whose tall and leaf-denuded branches shone the flames of his burning house. I entered the copse, dashing from one tree to another and clinging to them, and for a space I sought him in vain. Then amidst a heap of smashed branches and fencing that had banked itself against a portion of his garden, While I perceived something stir, I made a run for this, but before I reached it, a brown object separated itself, rose on two muddy legs and protruded to drooping, bleeding hands, some tatted ends of garment, fluttered out from its middle portion and streamed before the wind. For a moment I did not recognize this earthy lump. And then I saw it was Cavil, caked in the mud in which he had rolled. He leant forward against the wind. Rubbing the dirt from his eyes and mouth, he extended a muddy lump of hand and staggered the pace towards me. His face worked with emotion. Little lumps of mud kept falling from it. He looked as damaged and pitiful as any living creature I have ever seen. And his remark therefore amazed me exceedingly. "Congratulate me," he gasped. "Congratulate me. Congratulate you," said I. "Good heavens, what? For I've done it." "You have what on earth caused that explosion?" A gust of wind blew his words away. I understood him to say that it wasn't an explosion at all. The wind hurled me into collision with him, and we stood clinging to one another, try and get back to my bungalow. I bawled in his ear. He did not hear me, and he shouted something about 3 martyrs. Science, and also something about not much good. At the time he labored, under the impression that his 3 attendants had perished in the whirlwind. Happily this was incorrect directly. He had left for my bungalow. They had gone off to the public house in Lim to discuss the question of the furnaces over some trivial refreshment. I repeated my suggestion of getting back to my bungalow, and this time he understood. We clung arm in arm and started, and managed at last to reach the shelter of as much roof as was left to me. For a space we sat in armchairs and panted. All the windows were broken, and the lighter articles of furniture were in great disorder, but no irrevocable damage was done. Happily the kitchen door had stood the pressure upon it so that all my crockery and cooking materials had survived. The oil stove was still burning, and I put on the water to boil again for tea. And that prepared, I could turn on cover for his explanation. "Quite correct," he insisted. "Quite correct, I've done it, and it's all right." But I protested, "All right? Why, they can't be a rick standing, or a fence, or a thatched roof and damage for 20 miles around. It's all right really." I didn't, of course, foresee this little upset. My mind was preoccupied with another problem, and I'm apt to disregard these practical side issues. "But it's all right, my dear sir," I cried. "Don't you see? You've done thousands of pounds worth of damage there. I throw myself on your discretion. I'm not a practical man, of course. But don't you think they will regard it as a cyclone? But the explosion, it was not an explosion. It's perfectly simple. Only, as I say, I'm apt to overlook these little things. It starts a zoo business on a larger scale. Inadvertently, I made this substance of mine, this cavolite, in a thin, wide sheet." He paused. "You are quite clear that the stuff is opaque to gravitation, that it cuts off things from gravitating towards each other?" "Yes," said I. "Yes, well, so soon as it reached a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the process of its manufacture was complete, the air above it, the portions of roof and ceiling and floor above it, ceased to have weight. I suppose you know, everybody knows nowadays that as a usual thing. The air has weight, that it presses on everything at the surface of the earth, presses in all directions, with a pressure of 14 and 2 pounds to the square inch." "I know that," said I. "Go on." "I know that," he remarked. "Only this shows you how useless knowledge is, unless you apply it. You see, over our cover right, this ceased to be the case. The air there ceased to exert any pressure, and the air round it, and not over the cover right, was exerting a pressure of 14 pounds and a half to the square in upon this suddenly weightless air. You begin to see the air all about the cover right, crushed in upon the air above it. With irresistible force, the air above the cover right was forced upward violently, The air that rushed in to replace it immediately lost weight, ceased to exert any pressure. Followed suit, blew the ceiling through and the roof off. You perceive, he said, it formed a sort of atmospheric fountain, kind of chimney in the atmosphere, and if the coverite itself hadn't been loose, and so got sucked up the chimney, does it occur to you what would have happened? I suppose I said the air would be rushing up and up over that infernal piece of stuff. Now precisely, he said, a huge fountain spouting into space. Good heavens, why it would have squirted all the atmosphere of the earth away. It would have robbed the world of air. It would have been the death of all mankind, that little lump of stuff. Not exactly into space, said Cover, but as bad practically. It would have whipped the air off the world. As one peels a banana and flung it thousands of miles, it would have dropped back again. Of course, but on an asphyxiated world, from our point of view. Very little better than if it never came back. I stared. As yet I was too amazed to realize how all my expectations had been upset. What do you mean to do now? I asked in the first place. If I may borrow a garden travel, I will remove some of this earth, with which I am encased, and then, if I may avail myself of your domestic conveniences, I will have a bath this done. We will converse more pleasure. It will be wise, I think. He laid a muddy hand on my arm. If nothing was said of this affair beyond ourselves, I know I have caused great damage. Probably even dwelling houses may be ruined, here and there upon the countryside. But on the other hand, I cannot possibly pay for the damage I have done. And if the real cause of this is published, it will lead only to heartburning and the obstruction of my work. One cannot foresee everything, you know, and I cannot consent for one moment to add the burden of practical considerations to my theorizing. Later on, when you have come in with your practical mind, and cavorite is floated is the word, isn't it? And it has realized all you anticipate for it. We may set matters right with these persons, but not now if no other explanation is offered. People in the present, unsatisfactory state of meteorological science will describe all this to a cyclone. There might be a public subscription, and as my house has collapsed and been burned, I should in that case receive a considerable share in the compensation, which would be extremely helpful to the prosecution of our researches. But if it is known that I caused this, there will be no public subscription, and everybody will be put out. Practically, I should never get a chance of working in peace again. My 3 assistants may or may not have perished. That is a detail if they have. It is no great loss. They were more zealous than able, and this premature event must be largely due to their joint neglect of the furnace. If they have not perished, I doubt. If they have the intelligence to explain the affair, they will accept the cyclone story. And if during the temporary unfitness of my house for occupation, I may lodge in one of the untenanted rooms of this bungalow of yours. He paused and regarded me. A man of such possibilities, I reflected, is no ordinary guest to entertain. Perhaps today, rising to my feet, we had better begin by looking for a travel, and I led the way to the scattered vestiges of the greenhouse. And while he was having his bath, I considered the entire question alone. It was clear there were drawbacks to Mr. Cavill's society. I had not foreseen the absent-mindedness that are just escaped, depopulating the terrestrial globe, might at any moment result in some other grave inconvenience. On the other hand, I was young, my affairs were in a mess, and I was in just the mood for reckless adventure, with a chance of something good at the end of it. I was quite settled in my mind that I was to have half, at least in that aspect of the affair. Fortunately, I held my bungalow, as I have already explained, on a 3-year agreement, without being responsible for repairs and my furniture. such as there was of it, had been hastily purchased, was unpaid for, insured, and altogether devoid of associations. In the end, I decided to keep on with him and see the business through. Certainly, the aspect of things had changed very greatly. I no longer doubted at all the enormous possibilities of the substance, but I began to have doubts about the gun carriage and the patent boots. We set to work at once to reconstruct his laboratory and proceed with our experiments. Cavil talked more on my level than he'd ever done before. When it came to the question of how we should make the stuff next, of course we must make it again, he said with a sort of glee I had not expected in him. Of course we must make it again. We have caught a Tartar perhaps, but we have left the theoretical behind us, for good and all, if we can possibly avoid wrecking this little planet of ours we will, but there must be risks. There must be an experimental work that always are. And here is a practical man, you must come in for my own part. It seems to me we might make it. Headways perhaps, and very thin if I don't know. I have certain dim perception of another method. I can hardly explain it yet, but curiously enough it came into my mind while I was rolling over and over in the mud before the wind, and very doubtful how the whole adventure was to end, as being absolutely the thing I ought to have done. Even with my age we found some little difficulty. And meanwhile we kept at work restoring the laboratory. There was plenty to do before it became absolutely necessary to decide upon the precise form and method of our second attempt. Our only hitch was the strike of the 3 laborers who objected to my activity as a foreman. But that matter we compromised after 2 days' delay. Chapter 3, The Building of the Sphere. I remember the occasion very distinctly. When Cavil told me of his idea of the sphere, he had had intimations of it before, but at the time it seemed to come to him in a rush. We were returning to the bungalow for tea, and on the way he fell humming. Suddenly he shouted, "Oh, that's it, that finishes it." I sort of roller blind finishes what I asked. Space anywhere who? The moon. What do you mean why? It must be a sphere, that's what I mean. I saw I was out of it. And for a time I let him talk in his own fashion. I hadn't the ghost of an idea then of his drift. But after he had taken tea, he made it clear to me. "It's like this," he said. "Last time, I ran this stuff that cuts things off from gravitation into a flat tank with an overlap that held it down, and directly. It had cooled and the manufacture was completed. All that uproar happened, nothing above it weighed anything. The air went squirting up. The house squirted up, and if the stuff itself hadn't squirted up too, I don't know what would have happened. But suppose the substance is loose and quite free to go up, but will go up at once, exactly with no more disturbance than firing a big gun. But what good will that do? I'm going up with it." I put down my teacup and stared at him. "Imagine a sphere," he explained, "large enough to hold the people and their luggage. It will be made of steel lined with thick glass. It will contain a proper store of solidified air, concentrated food, water, distilling apparatus, and so forth, and enameled, as it were, on the outer steel, cavorite. Yes, but how will you get inside?" There was a similar problem about a dumpling. "Yes, I know. But how?" "Well, that's perfectly easy. An airtight manhole is all that is needed. That, of course, will have to be a little complicated. They will have to be above, so that things may be thrown out, if necessary, without much loss of air, like Jules Verne's thing in A Trip to the Moon." But Cavil was not a reader of fiction. "I begin to see," I said slowly. "And you could get in and screw yourself up, while the cover was warm, and as soon as it cooled down, it would become impervious to gravitation and off. You would fly at a tangent, you would go off in a straight line." I stopped abruptly. What is to prevent the thing traveling in a straight line into space forever? I asked, you're not safe to get anywhere, and if you do, how will you get back? I'm just thought of that said. Cover, that's what I meant when I said the thing is finished. The inner glass sphere can be airtight, and except for the manhole continuous, and the steel sphere can be made in sections, each section capable of rolling up, after the fashion of a roll-up blind. These can easily be worked by springs and released, unchecked by electricity, conveyed by platinum wires fused through the glass well. That is merely a question of detail, so you see. Except for the thickness of the blind rollers. The catalyte exterior of the sphere will consist of windows, or blinds, whichever you like to call them. Well, when all these windows or blinds are shut, no light, no heat, no gravitation, no radiant energy of any sort will get at the inside of the sphere. It will fly on through space in a straight line. As you say, but open a window. Imagine one of the windows open that at once. Any heavy body that chances to be in that direction will attract us. I sat taking it, and you see. He said, oh, I see. Practically we shall be able to talk about in space. Just as we wish get attracted by this and that. Oh yes, that's clear enough. Only, well, I don't quite see what we should do it for. It's really only jumping off the world and back again. Surely, for example, one might go to the moon, and when one got there, oh, what would you find? Oh, we should see. Oh, consider the new knowledge. Is the air there? Maybe it's a fine idea, I said, but it strikes me as a large order. All the same, the moon. I'd much rather try some smaller things first. We're out of the question because of the air difficulty. Why not apply that idea of spring blinds, cover right blinds in strong steel cases? To lifting weights, it wouldn't work. He insisted, after all, to go into outer space is not so much worse, if at all, than a polar expedition. Men go on polar expeditions, not businessmen, and besides, they get paid for polar expeditions. And if anything goes wrong, there are relief parties, but this, it's just firing ourselves off the world for nothing. Call it prospecting. You'll have to call it that. One might make a book of it, perhaps, I said. I have no doubt there will be minerals. Said Cover, for example, oh, sulfur ores, gold perhaps. Possibly new elements, cost of carriage, I said. You know, you're not a practical man. The moon's 250,000 miles away, it seems to me. It wouldn't cost much to cart any weight anywhere. If you packed it in a cover, right case. I had not thought of that, delivered free on head of purchaser. Hey, it isn't as though we were confined to the moon. You mean there's Mars' clear atmosphere, novel surroundings, exhilarating sense of lightness. It might be pleasant to go there. Is there air on Mars? Oh yes. Seems as though you might run it as a sanatorium. By the way, how far is Mars? 200 million miles at present, said Catherarily, and you go close to the sun. My imagination was picking itself up again. After all, I said, there's something in these things, this travel. An extraordinary possibility came rushing into my mind. Suddenly I saw, as in a vision, the whole solar system, threaded with Kavita liners and spheres. Deluxe rights of preemption came floating into my head. Planetary rights of preemption. I recall the old Spanish monopoly in American gold. It wasn't as though it was just this planet or that. It was all of them. I stared at Cavill's rubricant face, and suddenly my imagination was leaping and dancing. I stood up, I walked up and down. My tongue was unloosened. I'm beginning to take it in. I said, I'm beginning to take it in. The transition from doubt to enthusiasm seemed to take scarcely any time at all. But this is tremendous, I cried. This is imperial. I haven't been dreaming of this sort of thing. Once the chill of my opposition was removed, his own pent-up excitement had play. He too got up and paced. He too gesticulated and shouted. We behaved like men inspired. We were men inspired. We'll settle all that, he said in answer to some incidental difficulty. That had pulled me up. We'll soon settle that. We'll start the drawings for moldings this very night. "We'll start them now," I responded. And we hurried off to the laboratory to begin upon this. Worked forthwith, I was like a child in Wonderland. All that night, the dawn found us both still at work. We kept our electric light going, heedless of the day. I remember now exactly how these drawings looked. I shaded and tinted, while Caval drew smudge and haze mark. They were in every line, but wonderfully correct. We got out the orders for the steel blinds and frames we needed from that night's work, and the glass sphere was designed within a week. We gave up our afternoon conversations and our old routine altogether. We worked and we slept and ate when we could work, no longer for hunger and fatigue. Our enthusiasm infected even our 3 men, though they had no idea what the sphere was for. Through those days, the man gave up walking and went everywhere, even across the room at a sort of fussy run. And it grew the sphere December past January. I spent a day with a broom, sweeping a path through the snow. From bungalow to laboratory February, March. By the end of March, the completion was in sight. In January had come a team of horses, a huge pack in case. We had our thick glass sphere now, ready and in position under the crane. We had rigged to sling it into the steel shell. All the bars and blinds of the steel shell. It was not really a spherical shell, but polyhedral, where they roller blind to each facet, had arrived by February, and the lower half was bolted together. The cavalite was half made. By March, the metallic paste had gone through 2 of the stages in this manufacture, and we had plastered quite half of it onto the steel bars and blinds. It was astonishing how closely we kept to the lines of Caval's first inspiration in working out the scheme. When the bolting together of the sphere was finished, he proposed to remove the rough roof of the temporary laboratory in which the work was done and build a furnace about it. So the last stage of coverite making, in which the paste is heated to a dull red glow in a stream of helium, would be accomplished when it was already on the sphere, and then we had to discuss and decide what provisions we were to take. Compressed foods, concentrated essences, steel cylinders containing reserve oxygen, an arrangement for removing carbonic acid and waste from the air, and restoring oxygen by means of sodium peroxide, water condensers, and so forth. I remember the little heap they made in the corner. Tins and rolls and boxes convincingly. Matter of fact, it was a strenuous time with little chance of thinking. But one day when we were drawing near the end, an odd mood came over me. I have been breaking up the furnace all the morning, and I sat down by these possessions deadbeat. Everything seemed dull and incredible. But look here, Caval, I said. After all, what's it all for? He smiled. The thing now is to go the moon. I reflected, but what you expect? I thought the moon was a dead world. He shrugged his shoulders. We are going to see, are we? I said, and stayed before me. You are tired, he remarked. You'd better take a walk this afternoon. No, I said obstinately. I'm going to finish this brickwork. And I did, and ensured myself a night of insomnia. I don't think I have ever had such a night. I had some bad times before my business collapse, but the very worst of those was sweet slumber. Compared to this infinity of aching wakefulness, I was suddenly in the most enormous funk at the thing we were going to do. I do not remember before that night thinking at all of the risks we were running. Now they came like that array of specters at once. Beleaguered Prague encamped around me. The strangeness of what we were about to do, the unearthliness of it overwhelmed me. I was like a man awakened out of pleasant dreams to the most horrible surroundings. I lay eyes wide open, and the sphere seemed to get more flimsy and feeble, and Caval more unreal and fantastic, and the whole enterprise matter and matter. Every moment I got out of bed and wandered about. I sat at the window and stared at the immensity of space. Between the stars was the void, the unfathomable darkness, I tried to recall the fragmentary knowledge of astronomy I had gained in my irregular reading, but it was all too vague to furnish any idea of the things we might expect. At last, I got back to bed and snatched some moments of sleep. Moments of nightmare, rather, in which I fell and fell and fell, forevermore into the abyss of the sky. I astonished Cover at breakfast. I told him shortly, "I'm not coming with you in the sphere." I met all his protest with a sullen persistence. "The thing's too mad," I said, "and I won't come the thing's too mad." I would not go with him to the laboratory. I fretted about my bungalow for a time, and then took hat and stick and set out alone. I knew not whither it chanced to be. A glorious morning, a warm wind and deep blue sky, the first green of spring abroad, and multitudes of birds singing. I lunched on beef and bear, and a little public house near Alum, and startled the landlord by remarking, apropos of the weather, "A man who leaves the world, when days of this sort are about, is a fool." That's what I says when I heard on it, said the landlord, and I found that for one poor soul, at least this world had proved excessive, and there had been a throat cutting. I went on with a new twist to my thoughts. In the afternoon, I had a pleasant sleep in a sunny place, and went on my way refreshed. I came to a comfortable looking inn near Canterbury. It was bright with creepers, and the landlady was a clean old woman and took my eye. I found I had just enough money to pay for my lodging with her. I decided to stop the night there. She was a talkative body, and among many other particulars, learned she had never been to London. "Can't a breeze as far as ever I been," she said. "I'm not one for your gadabouts. Or how would you like a trip to the moon?" I cried, "I never did hold with them balloonies." She said, evidently under the impression that this was a common excursion. Enough, I wouldn't go up in one, not forever, so this struck me as being funny. After I'd sucked, I sat on a bench by the door of the inn and gossiped with two laborers about brickmaking and motor cars and the cricket of last year, and in the sky a faint new crescent, blue and vague as a distant Alp, sank westward over the sun. The next day I returned to Cavil. "I am coming," I said. "I've been a little out of order, that's all." That was the only time I felt any serious doubt. Our enterprise nerves purely. After that I worked a little more carefully, and took a trudge for an hour every day, and at last saved for the heating in the furnace. Our labors were at an end. Chapter 4, Inside the Sphere. "Go on," said Cavall, as I sat across the edge of the manhole and looked down into the black interior of the sphere. We two were alone. It was evening. The sun had set, and the stillness of the twilight was upon everything. I drew my other leg inside and slid down the smooth glass to the bottom of the sphere, then turned to take the cans of food and other impedimental from Cavil. The interior was warm. The thermometer stood at 80, and, as we should lose little or none of this by radiation, we were dressed in shoes and thin flannels. We had, however, a bundle of thick woolen clothing and several thick blankets to guard against mischance. By Cavill's direction I placed the packages, the cylinders of oxygen and so forth, loosely about my feet, and soon we had everything in. He walked about the ruthless shed for a time, seeking anything he had overlooked, and then crawled in after me. I noted something in his hand. "What have you got there?" I asked. "Haven't you brought anything to read?" "Good Lord, no. Oh, I forgot to tell you. There are uncertainties. The voyage may last, maybe weeks, but we shall be floating in this sphere with absolutely no occupation. I wish I'd known." He peered out of the manhole. "Look," he said. "There's something there. Is there time? We should be an hour." I looked out. It was an old number of Titbits that one of the men must have brought, farther away in the corner. I saw a torn Lloyd's News. I scrambled back into the sphere with these things. "What have you got?" I said. I took the book from his hand and read. "The Works of William Shakespeare." He colored slightly. My education has been so purely scientific. He said apologetically, never read him, never. He knew a little, you know, in an irregular sort of way. Precisely what I am told, said cover. I assisted him to screw in the glass cover of the manhole, and then he pressed the stud to close the corresponding blind. In the outer case, the little oblong of twilight vanished. We were in darkness for a time. Neither of us spoke, although our case would not be impervious to sound. Everything was very still. I perceived there was nothing to grip. When the shock of our start should come, and I realized that I should be uncomfortable. For one of a chair. Why have we no chairs, I asked. I've settled all that, said cover. We won't need them, why not? You will see, he said, in the tone of a man who refuses to talk. I became silent. Suddenly it had come to me clear and vivid that I was a fool to be inside that sphere. Even now I ask myself, is it too late to withdraw? The world outside the sphere I knew would be cold and inhospitable enough for me. For weeks I'd been living on subsidies from Cavil. But after all, would it be as cold as the infinite zero, as inhospitable as empty space? If it had not been for the appearance of cowardice, I believe that even then, I should have made him let me out. But I hesitated on that score, and hesitated and grew fretful and angry. And the time passed. There came a little jerk, a noise like champagne being uncorked in another room, and a faint whistling sound. For just one instant I had a sense of enormous tension, a transient conviction of my feet were pressing downward. With a force of countless tons, it lasted for an infinitesimal time. But it stirred me to action. Cavil, I said into the darkness. My nerves are in rags, I don't think. I stopped. He made no answer. Found it, I cried. I'm a fool, what business have I here? I'm not coming, cover the things, too risky, I'm getting out. You can't, he said. Can't. We'll soon see about that. He made no answer for 10 seconds. It's too late for us to quarrel now, Bedford. He said. That little jerk was the start. Already we are flying as swiftly as a bullet, up into the gulf of space. I said. And then it didn't seem to matter what happened. For a time I was, as it were, stunned. I had nothing to say. It was just as if I had never heard of this idea, of leaving the world before. Then I perceived an unaccountable change in my bodily sensations. It was a feeling of lightness, one reality. Coupled with that was a queer sensation in the head, an apoplectic effect almost, and a thumping of blood vessels at the ears. Neither of these feelings diminished as time went on. But at last I got so used to them that I experienced no inconvenience. I heard a click and a little glow lamp came into being. I saw Cavil's face as white as I felt my own to be. We regarded one another in silence. The transparent blackness of the glass behind him made him seem as though he floated in a void. Well, we're committed, I said at last. Yes, he said. We are committed. Don't move, he exclaimed at some suggestion of a gesture. Let your muscles keep quite lax as if you're in bed. We are in a little universe of our own. Look at those things. He pointed to the loose cases and bundles that had been lying on the blankets in the bottom of the sphere. I was astonished to see that they were floating now, nearly a foot from the spherical wall. Then I saw from his shadow that Cavil was no longer leaning against the glass. I thrust at my hand behind me and found that I too was suspended in space clear of the glass. I did not cry out nor gesticulate, but fear came upon me. It was like being held and lifted by something, you know not what. The mere touch of my hand against the glass moved me rapidly. I understood what had happened. But that did not prevent my being afraid. We were cut off from all exterior gravitation. Only the attraction of objects within our sphere had effect. Consequently, everything that was not fixed to the glass was falling, slowly because of the slightness of our masses, towards the center of gravity of our little world, which seemed to be somewhere about the middle of the sphere, but rather nearer to myself than Cavil. On account of my greater weight, we must turn around to cavall and float back to back with the things between us. It was the strangest sensation conceivable. Floating thus loosely in space, at first indeed, horribly strange. When the horror passed, not disagreeable at all. Exceeding restful indeed, the newest thing in earthly experienced with, that I know is lying on a very thick, soft feather bed. But the quality of utter detachment and independence. I had not reckoned on things like this. I'd expected a violent jerk at starting. A giddy sense of speed instead. I felt as if I were disembodied. It was not like the beginning of a journey. It was like the beginning of a dream. Chapter 5, The Journey to the Moon. Presently Cavell extinguished the light. He said we had not over much energy stored, and that what we had we must economize for reading, for a time whether it was long or short. I do not know, there was nothing but blank darkness. A question floated up out of the void. How are we pointing, I said. What is our direction? We are flying away from the earth at a tangent, and as the moon is near her third quarter, we are going somewhere towards her. I will open a blind. Came a click, and then a window in the outer case yawned open. The sky outside was as black as the darkness within the sphere, but the shape of the open window was marked by an infinite number of stars. Those who have only seen the starry sky from the earth cannot imagine its appearance when the vague, half-luminous veil of our air has been withdrawn. The stars we see on earth are the mere, scattered survivors that penetrate our misty atmosphere, but now at last I could realize the meaning of the hosts of heaven, stranger things we were presently to see. But that airless star-dusted sky, of all the things, I think that will be one of the last I shall forget. The little window vanished with a click, another beside it snapped open, and instantly closed, and then a third, and for a moment I had to close my eyes. Because of the blinding splendor of the waning moon, first base I had to stare at. Cavell on the white-lit things about me, to season my eyes to light again, before I could turn them towards that pallid glare. For windows were open, in order that the gravitation of the moon might act upon all the substances in our sphere. I found I was no longer floating freely in space, but that my feet were resting on the glass in the direction of the moon. The blankets and cases of provisions were also creeping slowly down the glass and presently came to rest, so as to block out a portion of the view. It seemed to me, of course, that I looked down when I looked to the moon. On earth, down means earthward, the way things fall, and up the reverse direction. Now the pull of gravitation was towards the moon, and for all I knew to the country, our earth was overhead, and of course, when all the cover right blinds were closed, down was towards the center of our sphere, and up towards its outer wall. It was curiously unlike earthly experience to have the light coming up to one, on earth. Light falls from above or comes slanting down sideways, but here it came from beneath our feet. And to see our shadows we have to look up at first. It gave me a sort of vertigo. To stand only on thick glass and look down upon the moon. Through hundreds of thousands of miles of vacant space, but this sickness passed very speedily. And then the splendor of the sight, the reader may imagine at best, if he will lie on the ground some warm summer's night, and look between his appraised feet at the moon. But for some reason, probably because the absence of air made it so much more luminous, the moon seemed already considerably larger than does from Earth. The minutest details of its surface were acutely clear, and since we did not see it through air, its outline was bright and sharp. There was no glow or halo about it, and the stardust that covered the sky came right to its very margin and marked the outline of its unilluminated part. And as I stood and stared at the moon between my feet, that perception of the impossible, that had been with me off and on ever since our start, returned again with tenfold conviction. Kavil, I said, this takes me clearly. Those companies we were going to run. And all that about minerals, well, I don't see him here. No, said Kava, but you'll get over all that. I suppose I'm made to turn right side up again. Still this, for a moment, I could half believe there never was a world. That copy of Lloyd's News might help you. I stared at the paper for a moment, then held it above the level of my face, and found I could read it quite easily. I struck a column of mean little advertisements. A gentleman of private means is willing to lend money. I read I knew that gentleman. Then, somebody eccentric wanted to sell a cutaway bicycle. Quite new and cost £15 for £5, and a lady in distress wished to dispose of some fish. Knives and forks, a wedding present at a great sacrifice. No doubt some simple soul was sagely examining these knives and forks, and another triumphantly riding off on that bicycle, and a third trustfully consulting that benevolent gentleman of means. Even as I read, I laughed and let the paper drift from my hand. Are we visible from the earth? I asked why. I knew someone who was rather interested in astronomy. It occurred to me that it would be rather odd if my friend chanced to be looking through some telescope. It would need the most powerful telescope on Earth, even now, to see us at the minutest speck. For the time I stared in silence the moon. It's a world, I said. One feels that, infinitely more than one ever did on Earth. People, perhaps people. He exclaimed, no, banish all that. Think yourself a sort of ultra-Arctic voyager, exploring the desolate places of space. Look at it. He waved his hand at the shining whiteness below. It's dead, dead, vast extinct volcanoes, lava wildernesses, tumbled wastes of snow or frozen carbonic acid, or frozen air, and everywhere landscapes. Seams and cracks and gulfs, nothing happens. Men have watched this planet systematically, with telescopes for over 100 years. How much change do you think they have seen? None. They have traced to indisputable landscapes, a doubtful crack, and one slight periodic change of color. And that's all. I didn't know they traced even that. Oh yes, but as for people, by the way, I asked, how small a thing? Will the biggest telescope show up on the moon? One could see a fair-sized church. One could certainly see any towns or buildings, or anything like the handiwork of men. They might perhaps be insects, something in the way of ants, for example, so that they could hide in deeper burrows from the lunar light, or some new sort of creatures, having no earthly parallel. That is the most probable thing. If we are to find life there at all, think of the difference in conditions. Life must fit itself too. A day as long as 14 earthly days, a cloudless sun blaze of 14 days, and then a night of equal length, growing ever colder and colder under these cold, sharp stars in that night. There must be cold, the ultimate cold, absolute 0 to 173 degrees, said to grade below the earthly freezing point. Whatever life there is must hibernate through that, and rise again each day, he mused. One can imagine something, worm-like, he said, taking its air solid as an earthworm swallows earth, or thick-skinned monsters by the vi. I said, why didn't we bring a gun? He did not answer that question. No, he concluded. We just have to go. We shall see when we get there. I remembered something. Of course, there's my minerals anyhow. I said, whatever the conditions may be presently. He told me he wished to alter our course a little. By letting the earth tuggard us for a moment, he was going to open one earth with blind. For 30 seconds, he warned me that it would make my head swim, and advised me to extend my hands against the glass to break my fall. I did as he directed, and thrust my feet against the bales of food cases and air cylinders to prevent their falling upon me. Then with a click the window flew open. I fell clumsily upon hands and face, and saw for a moment between my black extended fingers our Mother Earth, a planet in a downward sky. We were still very near. Cavil told me the distance was perhaps 800 miles, and the huge terrestrial disk filled all heaven, but already it was plain to see that the world was a globe. The land below us was in twilight and vague, but westwards the vast, gray stretches of the Atlantic shone like molten silver under the receding day. I think I recognized the cloud-dimmed coastlines of France and Spain, and the south of England, and then with a click, the shutter closed again, and I found myself in a state of extraordinary confusion, sliding slowly over the smooth glass. When at last things settled themselves in my mind again, it seemed quite beyond question that the moon was down and under my feet, and that the earth was somewhere away, on the level of the horizon, the earth that had been down to me and my kindred since the beginning of things, so slight with the exertions required us so easy. Did the practical annihilation of our weight make all we had to do, that the necessity for taking refreshment did not occur to us for nearly 6 hours. By Cover's chronometer after our start, I was amazed at that lapse of time. Even then I was satisfied with very little. Cavil examined the apparatus for absorbing carbonic acid and water and pronounced it to be in satisfactory order. How consumption of oxygen, having been extraordinarily slight, and our talk being exhausted for the time, and there being nothing further for us to do, we gave way to a curious drowsiness that had come upon us. Quoc hen tren na kang chamang lay nung tri giam mgi elma kanjup mi k nan kum faraja trothuk ss siabanan.